In the realm of science fiction, the planet Mars and armed revolutions for independence go hand in hand like Reese's peanut butter and literally everything else. Mankind has never set foot upon Mars' rusty surface, and yet it already has hundreds of years of lore detailing its struggle to gain freedom from a distant, tyrannical Earth. It's a popular, even tired trope, but as a high schooler in 2001, Red Faction's print advertisements featuring a stenciled arm holding up a pickaxe on a textured red background were an enticing invitation to help free Mars. That you can do it in a video game with environments so destructible that you can dynamically dig tunnels or blow up bridges, like this one with a tank about to roll over it, is super cool. Red Faction may be based on generic ideas, but the pitch was strong. Somewhere between those ads, the PlayStation 2 not having a lot of games in the summer of 2001 as kids got out of school, and developer Volition's geomod technology successfully kicking off a strong word-of-mouth campaign, the game wound up becoming a modest success. Over the next decade, the Red Faction franchise would add 4 more games, a made-for-TV movie, a comic, and then completely disappear. Why? I didn't personally dip my toe into the series until I watched Giant Bomb's quick look of the demo for 2009's Guerrilla, which sold me on how fun the game's destruction would be. To date, it's the only game in the series I'd played, much less beaten, so this review originally sought to cover those latter-day Red Faction games, Guerrilla and its direct sequel, 2011's Armageddon. But it quickly became apparent to me that the whole series deserved an evaluation in a format that wasn't framed as the glorious rise and tragic fall of Red Faction like some other channels do. Red Faction is a mishmash of concepts bound by environmental destruction. Each game feels different than the previous one, assembled by a Mad Libs of different science fiction tropes and action game standards. They feature different protagonists and enemies, their stories connected by a very tenuous and unserious lore. One of them doesn't even take place on Mars. Each game feels strangely ahead of their time and also behind it. This series is weird. Across really 2 games, Red Faction seems to hold a place in the hearts of dedicated gamers. But the franchise as a whole never seems to have ever met its potential as a Mars liberation simulator, a true exercise in environmental destruction, nor made much of a mark culturally. So what was Red Faction? What made it successful, and why did it disappear? Let's dig in and find out. It may not be the first, but it is the nth review, number 24, for the Red Faction series. Brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/the nth review. I saw news about Red Faction for PS2 as a teenager and knew I had to have it. The game was fine, but the fully destructible environment was a game changer for teenage me. It was one of those games that was like, the future isn't the game, but this game is the future. Fast forward 20 plus years to No Man's Sky, which pops to mind because I've been no-lifing it lately, with entire planets with completely malleable worlds. I genuinely wish more games, particularly competitive shooters, had environments that were as interactive and encouraged creativity like Red Faction does. Patreon producer, Rain101. Let's get a brief history lesson in here first. Before there was Champaign, Illinois-based Volition Inc., there was Champaign, Illinois-based Parallax Software, a company founded by programmers Mike Kulas and Matt Toshlag. And before I played Red Faction Guerrilla, I played Parallax's Descent games and Volition's Free Space games. On the precipice of Red Faction Armageddon's release in 2011, Game Informer magazine sat down with the staff of Volition and unknowingly filmed a documentary about the history of the company. It's easily the most insightful piece of media about the developer and those responsible for bringing all these games to life. Parallax's first game was Descent, a sci-fi 6 degrees of freedom shooter in which you navigate labyrinthine mines throughout the solar system to eliminate a new virus that's plaguing the mining robots that reside within. You acquire Doom-style colored key cards to access and blow up each mine's reactor before racing out an exit. Descent was not for the faint of heart with how twisty and weird it could get, but it was really successful for Parallax and publisher Interplay. Another Descent game arrived a year later, and the Parallax guys had enough money to allow its co-founders to amicably split up. Neither founder cared much for Champaign, Illinois, where Parallax was based, but it was Toshlog who ended up moving, taking a chunk of the Parallax team with him to form Outrage Games in Michigan, while Kulas stayed in Champaign to rebrand his half as Volition. Outrage would make Descent 3, while Volition's first game as a rebranded studio was Space Simulator Descent Free Space and its sequel, Free Space 2, which left off the Descent branding. By the turn of the century, people weren't playing PC games with joysticks as much anymore, so neither of their games moved many copies, despite the cult followings they'd built. Unfortunately, this trickled upstream to publisher Interplay, who was going out of business. Volition was already working on Descent 4 and a handoff from Outrage, so it shouldn't be a surprise that among their other commercial failures, Interplay couldn't afford to let Volition continue developing it. Interplay also wouldn't let them shop the game around, so it was effectively cancelled. THQ signed on as Volition's publisher and eventually purchased the studio outright in 2000. They would acquire Outrage in 2002. Red Faction made it out the door because it was produced relatively cheap with a small team. Thankfully, Volition had a head start with the work they'd already done on Descent 4. THQ also told Volition to quickly get used to bringing games to the PlayStation 2 when they'd previously developed exclusively for the PC. By making the PlayStation 2 a target platform, Red Faction's technical capabilities were fundamentally limited, but Sony's console would prove to be a cultural hit and a record-breaking seller. It was also short of quality games during its launch window, so positioning Volition's games there was a big deal. Their first ever console game was action RPG Summoner, which made the console's launch lineup in the United States. Red Faction would follow just 7 months later. Despite coming out in 2001, Red Faction feels like a simpler, less ambitious game than Half-Life or even Thief, both of which came out 3 years earlier.
Please, don't ask me to interfere.
It also felt substantially less ambitious than Microsoft's Halo, which redefined what console shooters could be when the original Xbox console launched 6 months later. As a single-player game, Red Faction is a relatively simple corridor shooter with vehicle sections and cutscenes interspersed. What ultimately sets this game apart from its peers is the game's geometry modification system, better known as GeoMod, which allows the player to destroy chunks of the level organically rather than just stamping walls with static burn images or switching in-game objects from a fixed state to a broken one. Among those I talked to who had fond memories of the original game, many recall its multiplayer modes that allowed them to create tunnels with friends thanks to the game's explosive tools. We can do that easily in Minecraft now, but in 2001, it was unique and new. While you can buy the game directly from Steam, it worked pretty easily on Windows 10 after I installed the community-recommended and supported Dash Faction update/executable. If you're tempted to fall down this rabbit hole with me, that's my recommendation as well.
What's that mean, you half-human freak?
Red Faction opens with our demolitions expert/meathead player protagonist, Parker, spelling out the situation as it stands on Mars.
I wanted some time to think, to figure out what to do with my life.
He signed up for a year of mining work with the Ultor Corporation on the Red Planet, but conditions are awful. Without any regulation whatsoever, Ultor is exploiting its workers, demanding long hours in their dangerous mines. On top of that, there's a plague sweeping through the worker camps. It's clear that Ultor's behind it, but I don't know why they'd want to manufacture and spread such a contagion when they need workers to make their economic machines work. Just a year earlier in 2000, which makes my head hurt with how old I am now, Walton Simons and Bob Page explained that a man-made plague kept the working class controlled by forcing them to plead for the conveniently limited vaccine. But don't get too excited. This is not high art. This is a simple bourgeoisie versus proletariat story, owner versus workers, where the latter is finally pushed far enough to snap back. And they're about to. As you play through the tutorial, which takes place in a Red Faction controlled facility before you've even signed on for the cause, the instructor warns that the rebellion is about to shift into full motion. The tension is nearly palpable. Before this tutorial concludes, you've experienced a full tour of the assets this makeshift rebellion has been acquiring, ready to use as soon as the keys are turned. They even have a submarine. Of course, as soon as you start the game, those keys are turned. Before you've had the time or space to make any choices, you are taking up arms against grey-uniformed Ultor mine guards. You'll encounter fellow miners in the Red Faction as you navigate the mines, but they die rather quickly to Ultor gunfire. The firmer parts of this rebellion are the ones you engage with over the radio. Engage is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. They just tell you what to do. Hendrix is an Ultor security employee and sympathizer who watches over you through the security systems, providing guidance and dropping help. And then there's the Red Faction's leader, Eos. She initially appears as enigmatic references in sprayed graffiti and secondhand stories before she starts directing you over the radio personally. You get to finally meet her in person in the same chamber where you encountered the game's notorious mid-game big bad, Axel Capek. An evil, floating researcher gremlin with a nanoshield, Capek leads the corporation's evil experiments in nanotechnology to breed notorious beasts. It's revealed that he developed the plague to produce an army of loyal zombie soldiers. You take out Capek in this game, but his legacy haunts the series. He's the only character whose name or works are referenced in all of Volition's mainline games. He's such a weird dude. It's so strange that he winds up becoming the ring that the franchise's lore hangs on. I guess the legacy continues with Saints Row's deification of Johnny Gat, for some reason.
If roles were reversed, God, I know they'd save me, but all my solutions involve murder sprees.
You'll always be on some task in this game, but it often feels like mundane busy work as the game leads you through various facilities, underground caves, Martian canyons, and even space. Eventually the plot reveals itself. After taking out Capek, you've got to send an SOS to the Earth Defense Force in hopes they send reinforcements to liberate Mars from Ultor's private oppression. When Red Faction finally exposes you to Geomod, it begins to feel like there's more potential in this game than any other shooter. Geomod allows you to deform the environment by, essentially, erasing chunks of the level with explosive instruments. Games like Minecraft and Severed Steel would eventually demonstrate how fun environmental deformation can be, but this was a noble early effort. It's such an interesting idea when you think about it. You're a miner, a demolitions expert with regular access to rockets and explosive charges. Why wouldn't you be able to deform the environment around you? Why wouldn't you be able to enter one of the more complex levels and improvise an alternate approach with explosives? Why wouldn't you be able to blow up a troublesome door or use shaped charges to bypass a security checkpoint? Ultimately, as a linear corridor shooter, the game provides few situations to take advantage of your explosive tools, and as a result, you take little advantage of the technology. That's probably why people enjoyed the multiplayer, because it allowed for more improvisational destruction when the campaign didn't. For me, the disappointment came quickly. While wandering around in the mines right out of the gate, I experimented with just carving a tunnel using explosives. But it wasn't long before A, I realized how futile this was because I had no idea where I was going with this tunnel. B, there was nowhere to tunnel to, making explosive improv less fun or easier to do than just following the intended path through the levels as a bone vanilla shooter. The game's linear levels and format aren't conducive to this kind of gameplay, and Volition knew that. Here's Mike Kulas explaining just that.
Something we thought we learned from Red Faction 2, destruction in a corridor shooter doesn't make that much sense. It's almost scripted, right? Like if that door is locked, okay, so I blow a hole through there. That's really not a whole lot different than I go over here and get the key and unlock the door or something like that. It's just another way of opening the door.
Ideally, this game wouldn't be laid out in a long string that prevents explosive experimentation. Even if the game's levels had more opportunities for geomod alteration, its usefulness is penned in by where they designed you to use it. It's not just that you don't know where to best take advantage of your explosives, so much of this environment is impervious to them. Unfortunately, the game doesn't signpost this enough, allowing you to waste precious charges on impervious surfaces that can only be stamped with ashen impact marks. I can blow up this wall, but not this identical one right next to it. Now, the early mines you start in do offer a couple of graffitied spots where you can place charges and blow them up to reveal secret rooms or provide some kind of alternate routes. But these little diegetic hint tags disappear from the game pretty quick. And then there's the fact that the game rarely doles out any rockets or charges as is, ever. Even if you want to experiment with blowing out a wall or digging a tunnel, you can't, because you need to save your precious explosive ammo for the hyper-specific handful of instances where the game needs you to use them. One annoying example of how these limitations conspire to inspire madness is when I reach this sub-pen and I need to lower this submarine for an underwater segment that also features combat. There's a security office here with a switch to lower the sub, but the door is locked. Even after the windows are shot out, you can't crouch jump into the office, and you can't access the switch from the outside. In my playthrough, the backup switch above the sub that the game tells you to climb to in case you can't get into the office didn't seem to work at all. I didn't have a rocket to blow open the office, so I was effectively soft-locked from making any further progress. I had to redo the entire previous section, losing half an hour's worth of gameplay just to save a rocket or two to blow up the security office. Specifically, I couldn't blow up the impervious wall next to it that would allow me to sneak around. I had to blow up the office itself. In the PC version, you get a bonus level called Glass House, where you can shoot out the windows of a glass and metal box, and carve out the rest of the place with rockets and explosives. It's neat to experiment with Geomod's potential here, and then lament the fact that you don't get too many opportunities to cash in on that potential in the actual game. Geomod would find more appropriate and interesting implementations in future games, but it makes me wonder if those who truly enjoyed this game were the ones who dug a few pointless tunnels with their friends in multiplayer, got bored, and just let the game collect dust on a shelf somewhere. Okay, so the game's main selling point, Geomod, is disappointingly limited. Now what? Well, that's the point where I realized that Red Faction, an otherwise straightforward corridor shooter, just isn't very fun. This is a game that hasn't aged well, and working through its levels, it reminded me of so many of the genre's growing pains it had in that transitional era. And not just in 2001, but even earlier. The first thing that frustrated me in this game was what felt like arbitrary difficulty. So much of this game was me picking off a handful of enemies, quick saving, then moving on to the next encounter, thanks in large part to the sparsely distributed medkits, armor, and ammo. This slowed my progress to a crawl in the back half of the game, where a lot of my game footage is just me dying over and over until I kill enemies in extremely precise and rehearsed ways. This was especially true of the game's pair of stealth sections, where you need to keep an arm's length away from patrolling enemies who may spot you and sound alarms. Since this isn't built out very well mechanically, you have no idea at any time how effectively stealthy you are until guards start calling you out and bullets start flying. In the GameFAQs walkthrough I used, the writer advises that a firefight is inevitable in the second stealth section no matter how careful you are or how effectively you save scum. Of course, you have to forfeit your entire inventory going into these sections and rebuild it when you leave. Here's the final section in the space station where you need to race to an escape pod as the computer is loudly announcing that it's about to blow up with a countdown callout that's way too fast. In this tiny little section, I need to navigate this sticky ladder. By the way, ladders are a fucking nightmare in this game. Kill 3 to 4 enemies, not helped by my gun's dramatically long load times, and then precisely tap the button for the proper escape pod. I need to do all of that in less than 20 seconds. 20 seconds that, in a modern playtesting environment, would highlight with the brightest markers flaws in the game's core systems and level design. There were also a few moments where I just completely ran out of ammo, and with the deadliness of enemies in close quarters combat, melee is discouraged. This is disappointing because the game gives you a hella cool flamethrower, and you rarely get to use it because ammo drops for it are so rare. Of course, the game has the opposite problem at times in the late game, when opponents have railguns and can one-shot you from really far away, which is so dope. I was tempted several times to outright cheat to get past some of these sections, but I bit down and pressed on, reload after reload. When you're manning a vehicle which will feature combat, the game needlessly limits how much ammo you have when these sections are short and limited in scope as is. Maybe they didn't want people carving tunnels or something with your cannons? That doesn't make much sense since your cannons can't deform the terrain anyway. The vehicle's health bar makes sense though. But then there's the matter that the game's AI is incredibly basic and almost entirely stupid. Legends of enemy and artificial intelligence design will tell you that it's far more realistic to make your opponents slower and less responsive in a video game, because a computer opponent with no restrictions can always defeat you faster than you can humanly react. They work faster than you can think and move faster than you can swing a mouse or push a thumb. Case in point, shooting at enemies, the game's primary task, felt a lot like poking at gnats with long toothpicks, gnats who dance away from the cursor incredibly fast. As soon as you can see an enemy in Red Faction, they also immediately have a line of sight on you too, even if they weren't looking in your direction. They just instantaneously know you're there. On the flip side, you can stumble upon enemies and they just stand there, doing nothing. Likewise, NPCs can get stuck in doorways, preventing you from leaving a room. About a third of the way in, you have to escort Altor exec Griffin to go see Eos.
Take me to Eos.
What do you know about Eos?
Altor knows all about her.
Once you leave the office complex, it's not so bad. But inside the office, there's no telling how he behaves. He won't immediately or reliably follow you, he just stands there. The level becomes this kind of light-up puzzle where you move to different spots around him hoping to influence his behavior. If you kill one of the tutorial static red faction dudes, it's an automatic game over and a stern warning that the revolution has no room for Ultor sympathizers. Volition must have known that this wouldn't have been a good feature to keep in the actual game, even for dramatic purposes, because red faction troops die so incredibly easily. You will accidentally kill a lot of civilians and red faction members without any penalties at all. But then there are all the contemporary tropes that red faction features that are pretty recognizable if you're a gamer of my vintage. Levels are usually tedious sets of corridors with few defining features. Sometimes they're clever and offer branching paths to a similar destination, and that's kinda interesting the couple times it happens. The game's paper-thin radio play narrative, punctuated by rare cutscenes, required me to brute force my way through a lot of this game when it wasn't compelling on its own. Like other games of this era, a GameFAQs walkthrough was a mandatory feature on my second screen to keep me on track when objectives weren't clear or switches weren't visually obvious. And then there are all the small things. Enemies spawn from behind you, fast-moving bug things dodge your cursor even better than the humans can. There are timed sections, first-person platforming, and swimming sections. Here's a ladder whose geometry is too close to the wall, so it's constantly trying to force you off of it. This is especially frustrating since you need to climb it quickly after pressing a button so that you can cross some stopped fan blades to access another part of the level. Even better, this all occurs over a deep chasm that will kill you if you fall. There are crates everywhere and thin ledges to walk along. Vents, swamps, big empty rooms with little going on. Remember conveyor belts? They're back, in red faction form. But even with all of those things operating in concert against the player, the game's worst crime, another artifact of its era, is its unchecked ability to soft lock the player, preventing them from making any further progress. It's the result of not being able to fully scope the potential space of a game's design. Theoretically, if you need a rare power-up to beat the boss of level 5, but you need to use that same power-up in level 3 for some other task, there's a really good chance that players won't have the power-up they need to beat the boss in level 5 and move on to level 6. The only way to resolve the issue at that point is to redo what you did in level 3. I mentioned the sub-pen incident earlier, but it's just one of a trio of issues I experienced that undid hours of game time. Remember that space station? You have 3 objectives: blow up the station computers, blow up the reactor, and then escape, the dash I described earlier. But I made the mistake of blowing the station's reactor before blowing up the computers, something the game just lets the player do because you run by the reactor on the way to the other objectives anyway. Once you destroy the reactor, a countdown to the station's destruction starts over the PA. But once it reached 0, the station didn't do anything except continue to rumble, making combat with a limited amount of ammo really irritating. Besides that, the game didn't do anything. Upstairs, I spent most of an hour memorizing where every enemy, ammo pack, and medkit was and where the computers were because I couldn't quick save during that segment. Why? Because if I reloaded from that quick save, the screen immediately faded out and I died, sending me back to the main menu. Why? Because according to the game, the station shouldn't have existed anymore and I should have been dead. But the game didn't know how to handle this in real time as it happened for some strange reason. Volition hadn't planned for players to blow up the reactor before taking out the computers. Realistically, I should have been able to blow up the reactors to blow up the station and escape because the computers would have been destroyed with it, but whatever. I pressed on, and even after I took out every enemy and destroyed every computer, and I did all that with the shaking camera, I returned to the beginning of the level to find out that the elevator back down was blocked. Because of that, I couldn't progress any further. The only way around that was to reload from a save before I blew up the station's reactor. How far back was that? Way back on Mars, forcing me to lose an hour of progress. Thankfully, I moved a lot quicker this time around. And then there's the finale back on Mars, where you need to work down a series of repetitive hallways with one-shot railgunning opponents, combat fighters with rockets that can destroy you easily, and a final confrontation where I consistently ran out of ammo while dealing with the final boss's final stage. I'd struggled through all of that on foot, but it turns out the game gives you an aerial fighter to make nearly all of that easier and faster, giving you plenty of leeway and munitions to take out the final boss. Again, another chunk of time lost. So why didn't I know that I had an aerial fighter available? Because the game didn't signal that I'd have access to one by making it available very, very slowly when I'd already begun to move on down the level. In retrospect, it reminds me of the player who fought through the entirety of Half-Life 2's canal sequence slowly on foot when they couldn't figure out that there was an armed hovercraft available for them to use. But then there's the gameplay elements that Volition introduces you to in the tutorial, but you never need to engage with, ever. It's so neat to see that Volition can program this stuff into their games, but it's telling that they wouldn't find a way to implement it. Many of these elements feel like they're part of a stealth system that never seemed to cohere. You can pick up bodies and hide them, but the game never qualifies how a body is effectively hidden. You'll encounter a number of security hubs where you can look through a level's security cameras, but there's no gameplay attached to doing so. The game also allows you to holster your gun, presumably to not freak out civilian NPCs in the designated stealth sections, but it has no real function beyond that. I'm bagging on this game a lot. It was absolutely a slog that I wish came to an end far quicker than it did, but playing it wasn't completely miserable. There was a gentle sense of progression as you played, adopting Half-Life and Unreal's chain of level structure with brief, barely obstructive load screens. It really felt like you were working up from the mines into the Ultor machine and through other nefarious facilities they ran, even if the moment-to-moment level design and troublesome gameplay usually wouldn't let you enjoy it. Then again, those 2001 era mirrors are pretty neat too. I've got to call out that glass shattering tech again as well. That's reliably cool every time you do it. They should have had a research level where it's just a shootout with a million panes of glass between you and your Ultor opponents. While it's not fun when the game's railgun is being used against you, it is hella cool to use it against enemies, especially when its alternate mode allows you to snipe them through walls. There are 2 sniper rifles for some reason. They're cool, I guess. The rocket launcher as a weapon, and not just as a means to manipulate the environment, is pretty cool. And then there are the vehicle and turret sections that are enjoyable sprints. They're brief, but they shine, whether they're on the ground, in the air, or underwater. Watching enemy submarines implode underwater is a really nifty effect. Running over enemies in your Jeep thing felt a lot like when vehicles ran over infantry in Command & Conquer. Of course, as soon as you step out of these vehicles, you're immediately vulnerable, and sometimes that's not great. These sequences clearly build on Volition's experience from the Descent games, and it's hard not to cite these as an inspiration for Prey 2006's many vehicle sections too. Being a mid-budget shooter in 2001, the game looks okay technically, being held back by the limitations of the PlayStation 2 hardware, but artistically it looks bleh. The game's browns and reds interspersed with man-made grays really make so much of the game a visual smear. Screenshots in magazines and print ads looked decent to good at the time, but this is an era of low poly characters and minimal texture effects. Concept art for the game highlights the delta between hardware power of that time and what they dreamt of. Of course, you have to remember this was in 2001, when it seemed like each new game that hit store shelves was inventing some new visual trick that would become a graphical standard. The flashiest moments of Red Faction, like so many games back then, were its cutscenes, both in-engine and pre-rendered with in-engine assets. A noticeable distinction back then. Of course, cutscenes have to carry their weight and then some in this game, because the storytelling is pretty underwhelming, and the game desperately needs a reason to motivate you through its hours of frustrating gameplay. In 2001, soundtracks could go 2 ways, with either static pre-composed music tracks, or dynamic tracks of lesser fidelity that could adjust to the action or between levels or whatever. Red Faction banked on the former, while games like Deus Ex did the latter. The choice in this game leads to an awkward dissonance where the music is bombastic and strangely high fidelity compared to the relative crudeness of the rest of the experience.
Hold it, miner!
There are synthy tracks in here that feel right at home in the original Command & Conquer soundtrack, alongside more cinematic fare. But the prickliest part of their strategy comes when their music needs to loop, and there's a discrete gap between when the track ends and picks up again. This is particularly noticeable during the game's tensest moments. Volition's Mike Kulas describes the last stretch of Red Faction's development as a bit of a nightmare.
about 2 weeks before we were supposed to submit, I called my boss and said, I think we need more time to make this game better. Really, we didn't have a prayer. We wouldn't admit it to ourselves at the time. It was only when we were about 2 weeks away when we said, this is not going to happen. And they gave us 2 more months, I guess. But people were working really hard up to that point, trying to submit that game. And then we said, good news, we've got 2 more months for you to work really hard so we can submit this game. So it was really, in some ways, typical of many game developments. But it was an intensely difficult development cycle for those guys.
Red Faction set a new standard for destruction in a video game before games like Mercenaries or Just Cause showed up, but it kind of forgot how to implement it meaningfully. Without the geomod technology, it's not hard to see Red Faction as one of a slew of first-person shooter games from the aughts that hit store shelves and were quickly forgotten. This class of dime a dozen games filled bargain bins with discount stickers hand-stamped onto the original shrink wrapping. Their contents were filled with tired, unoriginal tropes, plots that weren't memorable, characters that don't matter, gameplay that's almost insultingly standard, and graphics that weren't handsome, ultimately forming an unremarkable 5 to 10 hour experience. Knowing that the single player is a bit of a slog, you might be tempted to dive into the multiplayer modes that made the game glow in its heyday, but good luck finding anyone to play with these days. I get that PS2 owners still didn't have a whole lot of choices for games in May 2001, because the game wound up, by several accounts, being the franchise's most financially successful entry. But Red Faction was far from a killer app, and to their credit, Volition recognized this to an extent. There's a lot of promise in here. This game lays the blueprint for what games could be when the hardware caught up with their ambitions. At the same time, this game has aged so poorly that the average gamer would be hard-pressed to see that promise if they were motivated to pick up a copy. Playing it now and reading about people's accounts of it at the time, the positivity seems locked to that era when standards were a bit lower or choices were fewer. With an opportunity to get another swing at this concept with a sequel, Volition immediately went to work, with very interesting results.
We thought we would be heroes. Instead, we are renegades allied with the rebellious Red Faction. We are a squad of 6, nano-enhanced, united by our uniqueness and a common cause.
So let's set the stage. Volition was a company founded by programmers who understood the technical hard work of building games. They were a developer who would rather build their own tools than pay to license that tech from others. This philosophy allowed them to write their own destiny technologically and make the games that they dreamt of on their own terms. Red Faction made it out the door after 3 years of somewhat stressful development, including the creation of new technology in-house, but it would go on to sell quite a few copies. So what was Volition's reward? A sequel that needed to be developed and out the door before the holiday season of the following year, roughly 18 months away. A relatively short amount of time to make a game of Red Faction's caliber and ambition. The result was 2002's Red Faction 2, commonly known among fans as the black sheep of the series. I thought this was a weird distinction considering its mid-80s Metacritic aggregate rating, similar to other entries. I'd played Red Faction 2 before, very briefly, over 2 decades ago, on a PS2 demo disc, so playing it for this review was like flying in blind. Coming off the first game, it's clear from its opening moments that this is very different from what's come before. I mean, you even lose the hammer from the previous game in the logo, which was such an important symbol for the franchise. Gone is the sci-fi/tech-themed interface and visual identity of the original game, and in its place is a highly stylized look based heavily on vintage Soviet propaganda. It's designed to highlight the authoritarian dictator Sopot, who serves as the antagonist of the game, and the cruel state of affairs in the Commonwealth he runs. It's definitely a vibe, like, I just started art school a few weeks ago and this is so deep, backed up by the cartoony story you get to play through. Actually playing it, you quickly realize that this game's connection to the original is tenuous at best. You're not on Mars at all, you're back on Earth, which opens the game's color palette and gives you plenty of unfamiliar cities to fight through. If there weren't actual Red Faction fighters in here, it could get away with shedding the name entirely, because from the design to the tone to the minimal story to the mission design, it barely feels like a Red Faction game at all. With how different this game is, it seems like a bit of a miracle that they got it across the finish line on time at all. And this game is a very strange egg. Red Faction 2's tutorial opens with an in-game cinematic that begs comparison to Halo Silent Cartographer, but on an extreme diet. You're fighting in an elite, nanotech-enhanced super soldier squad for Chairman Sopot. Whether you think working for evil dictators is weird or super cool, this section is too brief to make you feel too much either way. You fight through a very crumbly resistance base to acquire this nanotechnology gun thing, which is apparently an artifact of Ultor's Axel Capek that's been passed among a lot of minor players back here on Earth to do stupid stuff. In his possession, Sopot follows Capek's thinking in making an army of loyal zombie soldiers and decides he doesn't want nanotech-enhanced super soldiers anymore, so he marks your squad for death. As a newly independent group of 6 highly trained, role-specific soldiers, a science fiction-themed A-team, you kick off a revenge tour to take out Sopot alongside the newly arrived Red Faction. They're led by this dude who looks like he got fired for trying to organize a union at the space Starbucks on the corner. Shrike, the team's vehicle handler, is voiced by none other than Jason Statham, who ends up providing a lot of the VO in the first mission.
But don't have a clear firing lane. You must take out those towers.
Lance Henriksen plays squad leader Molov, who's a bit of a dick. There's Quill, the sniper, the sultry hacker Tangier, and Repta, the cringy big gun guy. You play Alias, a demolitions expert, which fulfills the franchise's prophecy. Unlike the original game, where distant helpers check in on you periodically during your mostly solitary march of destruction, this game feels busy and coordinated like a theme park ride. There's always some radio chatter going on that perpetuates the game's drama or opens new objectives, making the game feel more involved and interesting than the original. The game's frequent radio chatter also facilitates its weird and sometimes cringy sense of humor, which stands out because the first game wasn't humorous in the slightest.
This is not my job! I am not cleaning any of this! I don't do blood and bodies! You get away from me! I quit! I quit!
Holistically, this combines to make the game feel more in line with the razor-thin experiences of the Call of Duty games that followed than the lonely protagonist shooters that were contemporary to the original game. Despite how much conversation occurs and how often the game changes the scenery compared to its predecessor, Red Faction 2 reserves very little bandwidth to tell its story. This means that nearly all of its major events and dramatic turns happen in very small cinematics. And I mean, not only are they brief exposition dumps, but they're almost literally the size of postage stamps on this 4K monitor. This is the raw recording that I had to blow up for this video. This also ensures your superstar squadmate colleagues never acquire more than paper-thin characterizations. They're basically cartoon characters. You get no sense of what the Commonwealth is or why Sopot was truly so evil, on and on. Beyond how visceral the action is moment to moment, none of the reasons why any of this is happening feel substantial. But then the game delivers a 1-2 punch. First, you finally get within arm's length of Sopot, and it's revealed that he's little more than a cardboard cutout of a figure like everyone else. There's nothing to his character at all. Big bad that the entire game is built around and you spend most of it pursuing is little more than a nothing burger.
Respect Sopot! Fear Sopot! Sopot is your master!
Secondly, after causing Sopot's fiery demise, squad leader Molov becomes the new leader of the Commonwealth. Drunk on equal parts power and purpose, he immediately labels you and Tangier as traitors for siding with the Red Faction, a group who wants to abolish nanotechnology, the same nanotechnology that makes your squad the special people they are. In a twist less sensical or believable than Corso's villainous turn in animated science fiction flick Titan AE, you spend the back half of this game battling most of the squad that you just worked alongside. This was just one of the many times where I thought that someone had taped over the actual Red Faction 2 that Volition had actually made with this random-ass action game. Red Faction 2's story is dumb and weird, but as grim as it sounds so far, the game is often a tighter, more fun experience than the original game. I definitely cut against the grain when it comes to the popular opinion about this game, which was a surprise to me playing it too. I went in expecting a bit of a disaster. But some might also call it a dumbed down experience compared to the original game, which I don't think is entirely wrong. This often feels like a light gun game with how many lengthy on-rail turret sequences there are. It also visually highlights switches you need to interact with in the environment that were sometimes less than obvious in the original game. There's no cap on ammo and vehicles like there is in the first game, and there's also plenty of ammo, armor, and med kits, so you're not having to fret between encounters either. I also have to give props to all of the Red Faction games for having sensible boss battles that don't take forever to whittle down a huge health bar. Thank you, Volition. Your objectives float on screen, keeping you on task as the game dishes out stuff to do, including bonus objectives that allow you to unlock concept art and stuff outside of the game. It notifies you of newly unlocked content so frequently and prominently that it visually competes with information about the actual mission objectives. I didn't cry at the lack of quick saves or an inability to save scum because the game is shorter than the original, with tighter, more detailed environments, and small segments with more frequent, short loads. There's very little filler content. The spaces are more efficiently utilized with fewer big empty rooms. There are interesting levels, like your initial infiltration of the dictator's TV studio, complete with a reporter who's still broadcasting live from the closet.
And his squad, with one of the attackers is in front of this reporter right now. He appears to be heavily armed and very dangerous. He's not an attractive man either. I fear for my life. He could turn on me at any moment. But I will continue to report to you live from this closet.
There's this military base you have to fight through with a mech that closes around you like Titanfalls does over a decade earlier. There's a graveyard, a cathedral, an underwater subpen, and other random locations. It feels inspired by Painkiller at times with how varied and somewhat random the settings are. It's also a better looking game than the original. Levels are more detailed, allowing for more granular destruction, more interesting atmospheres, and particle effects. With a more lively Earth setting instead of the boring visual tedium of Mars, you get to see more of the color range on display here. The game features a new user experience and interface that looks both better and worse than the first game. 3D busts of your teammates float in the corner when they talk, and they're incredibly ugly. I wish they would have gone with more stylized 2D portraits instead. There are also plenty of Windows default fonts throughout, which always sucks. Portions of the interface design sport that overly busy Y2K aesthetic that the first game didn't have, which was also released closer to Y2K. For housekeeping purposes, while I needed some help to get Red Faction running, Red Faction 2 ran straight off of Steam without issue. So, Geomod. Geomod feels more effectively deployed here than the original game. Environments and props blow up more easily and more often as you work through tighter levels that make the damage more noticeable and meaningful. The game also effectively sandboxes your expectations about what the dynamic damage can be. You know pretty immediately what you can damage or blow up and what you can't, so you're not wasting ammo on stuff that isn't going to give way. You're not able to dig tunnels into the earth with your explosive charges, so you can focus on the environments around you and not fantasize about digging from one space to another. The PlayStation 2 still didn't allow Geomod to reach its destructive potential, but being able to damage and destroy a lot more stuff more effectively feels great. That said, in establishing a lower ceiling for Geomod's expectations in this game, I can understand how fans of the original would be disappointed when they opened this up and started playing it on Christmas Day in 2002. And then there were pain points. For example, there's local multiplayer, but good luck finding anyone to play with these days. You'll have access to lots of guns, which is great because all of the pistols feel like trash, immediately turning enemies into bullet sponges even when dual wielding them, which you get to do in here years before you can in Halo 2. Take that, Bungie! The railgun is back, but it no longer displays the silhouettes of enemies beyond walls. They're just animated radial animations, and that's not as fun. The weapon selection menu shows your guns in profile but doesn't label them, so it can be difficult to sort them out as your collection grows. Pistols and dual pistols are obviously excluded. To remind you that this is a game that came out in 2002, it includes an elaborate underground sewer level with tiny robot bugs to destroy, harkening back to 2000's iconic shooter, Daikatana. I honestly wonder if the inclusion was part of console cert, because I can't understand why anyone would ever think they're fun to play through. Similarly, but not quite as egregious, there's also the mandatory walking along a rail line while having to periodically dodge incoming trains level 2. The AI isn't as rough this time around, but helpers can still get stuck and block your progress. Repta blocking the doorway here wouldn't be so bad if I could blow out the wall next to him, but I can't. And of course, Geomod this early on is still just erasing stuff without any applicable physics, so you can very easily just leave portions of barriers just floating there, suspended in the air. This is such a weird, completely unexplainable departure from the first game. It's an improvement in a lot of ways, but it also falls flat on its face in others. It's more fun to play, but the narrative and storytelling didn't have quite enough rods to pitch a tent. Yeah, I'm gonna keep that in the script. I really hate its sense of style. The game is super obnoxious at times, but when it gets out of its own way, when it stops cramming you into turret sequences, it's fun, and it finishes before it runs out of fuel, which makes it the perfect rental. Still, it's so strange that they thought this was the method and the time to pivot the franchise into such weird, uncharted waters, or that this is what Red Faction needed creatively. The original game is really unchallenging thematically, but why? Why this? Why change the palette so drastically? I mean, I'm glad they did it, but playing these first two games back to back is pure whiplash, and it won't be the last time I say that about this franchise. THQ was clearly in a financial crunch at the time, which explains why they wanted the sequel out after just a year of development, visible on store shelves that holiday. Outrage Games, yes, that Outrage Games, ported this to PC and Xbox and released their one and only original game afterward, Alter Echo, which bombed with critics and people who didn't end up buying it. THQ would close them not long afterward. Volition got to skate past the carnage as they would for nearly the rest of their existence until they didn't, but we're not getting there in this review. Despite its reputation as the series' worst game, Red Faction 2 surprised me. When you compare these two to their contemporaries, to other games you could spend $49.99 MSRP on, they're two single-A or double-A shooters that don't have a lot going on for them in a franchise that never built much momentum. The first Red Faction sold enough copies to earn the critically important Greatest Hits label on the PlayStation 2, which extended its shelf life. This game, unable to please the existing fanbase and unable to find a newer, bigger one, would wind up in the bargain bin as little more than an oddity, a misfire. But what could Volition do in such a short period of time? So many shooters of this era were ordered to include multiplayer modes, even if they didn't fit thematically, even if they shipped with minimal features, even if they felt tacked on, so that it wouldn't become blockbuster rental fodder. In failing to get this game online, they chopped off the game's sales, forcing it to rely almost exclusively on its weirdly fun and weirdly different campaign that didn't feel connected to the original game at all. It's hard to sift out all of the weird decisions made in the creation of this game. Internally, Volition thought that the poor reception to Red Faction 2 broke the franchise. For fans, it was undoubtedly a disappointment compared to the original game. THQ was not a rich company flush with cash, nor did they have strong core franchises to buoy the rest of their commercial failures like this game, so they leaned on their licensed titles. Red Faction had two chances to strike gold at this point, and they never seemed to get much further than the Pickaxe store. Did Red Faction need a rest, or did it need to be retired? Would they ever truly get the concept right? To that end, what was Red Faction at all? As Volition pivoted to Saints Row to cash in on the trend of urban open-world action games, aka Grand Theft Auto-likes, Red Faction would lay dormant for the next 7 years, effectively marking the end of one era for the franchise and laying the groundwork for a new, higher fidelity one. But Volition wasn't sleeping on the series entirely. Away from the prying eyes of the public, they eventually got their hands on new hardware from Microsoft and Sony that fundamentally changed what a Red Faction game could be.
Alec Mason, mining engineer, demolitions class C. Report to Parker sector.
Armed with plenty of open-world experience after two Saints Row games, which were pretty popular, as well as the arrival of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, Volition returned to Red Faction with Red Faction Guerrilla, a game that wound up becoming an entry point to the series for many gamers when it released in June 2009. I was one of them. Guerrilla is, at its root design level, a wonderful inversion of the original game. Thanks to their new Geomod 2.0 technology working hand in hand with Havoc physics, which became incredibly popular middleware in that console generation, your goal isn't to deform and burrow into the environment like the original game teased you to do. Instead, your job is to blow up predefined buildings and structures with high-fidelity destruction. Guerrilla lets you hack out a building's supports like an axe to a tree and watch it tumble over somewhat realistically. Smashing those buildings was so damn fun, they hung an entire game on it. Also, the Earth Defense Force that saved the day at the end of Red Faction is now the oppressive enemy force, mirroring Ultor's behavior in that game. This Martian landscape features 6 sectors to capture by completing specific missions, procedurally destroying specifically marked EDF facilities, and building support with local guerrillas to capture territory. Fighting over a region to change its color on a map is my catnip. It shouldn't surprise anyone that this is the longest section of the review because of how big it is, and how substantial a change it was compared to the original 2 games. You'll also probably notice a dramatic fall-off in references to Red Faction 2 from here on out. Sure, it wasn't well received, but its tangent from the lore of the original game made it easy to ignore. Also, all that stuff is happening on Earth. Who cares? For reference, I played the 2018 remastered edition of this game for this review. Not only does it feature some visual enhancements, it also contains all of the post-release content in one package, like the Demons of the Badlands DLC that I hadn't played until this review. In Guerrilla, you fulfill the franchise's prophecy by playing as Alec Mason, this game's demolition engineer who moves to Mars to work the mines with his brother Dan. The game doesn't hold your hand long before revealing Dan's shadowy accomplices in the newly resurrected Red Faction. Actually, what was the Red Faction doing in the 50 years between games? You know what? Maybe I don't want to know. In half a century, the EDF gave Mars breathable air and a hospitable atmosphere so you don't need to run around the surface in habitat suits anymore. Unfortunately, in mirroring the setup of the original game, the EDF have also gone full fascist, placing the planet's inhabitants under martial law with indiscriminate, oppressive policing. Turns out that they're also in cahoots with the Martian mining conglomerates, a savage pairing who will destroy your settlement to get to the sweet whatever underneath that they mine on this planet. I don't know if that's ever been established. After an effectively brief tutorial, your brother is spotted and mowed down by an EDF gunship because he's a wanted man. You're about to end up a victim of their beret and wraparound shades Super Troopers 2 before Dan's shadowy Red Faction accomplices swoop in to rescue you. Now you're an outlaw too! Alec broadcasts his displeasure with getting entangled with this whole Red Faction mess throughout the game's plot. The EDF is both understaffed enough to not walk up to your Red Faction safe house and arrest you, which is usually just off the main road, but they're also able to summon an infinite number of troops if you so much as breathe on one of their supply huts. As you wage an inch-by-inch guerrilla war with them, you're charged with liberating the Nanoforge, the game's MacGuffin from the old Ultor research labs of the original game. The device is an essential tool for the liberation of the planet, and its utility manifests twofold. The first is as a late-game rifle that your new pal Samanya improvises to vaporize structure and foe alike. The second is as the core component of a rocket that obliterates the EDF's massive Hydra flagship before it rains hellfire on the Martian colony. There's also some side lore about the Marauders, who are a Mad Max-themed tribal faction with improvised vehicles. They are somehow the descendants of the Ultor scientists who fled into the caves beneath Mars after the original game. I'm not quite sure how they diverged so much culturally in the 50 years between the 2 Mars revolutions depicted in the original game and then this game, but here we are. The Marauders don't get much daylight, but from what we do get, I wasn't particularly interested in exploring more. Actually, the DLC does focus on them, but we'll get to that. Something I didn't expect playing this game now versus my original playthrough 15 years ago were the references that I missed having never played the original games. Wandering through Capex's lab to pick up the Nanoforge, the arena where I'd struggled to beat him in the much older game, was awesome. I hadn't previously picked up on the fact that the Parker and EO sectors were named after the protagonists of the original game either. It makes this game feel like a more loyal sequel to that game than its actual direct sequel. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3's enhanced ability to process physics over their predecessors really make this game special. Knocking out supports for buildings and causing realistic damage is a blast. Unlike previous games where you're merely erasing portions of the landscape or structures, merely unexisting things that exist, the parts you damage or tear up still exist. Bash out a wall and it doesn't disappear, it falls to your feet. As you manually disassemble a building, all this rubble begins accumulating until the game decides it can't compute anymore and it gradually phases out. It really establishes a sense of scale and accomplishment on a structure-by-structure basis. But there's even more depth here. Buildings will be constructed with layers of different materials, which makes their destruction strategic when it never was before. It's fun to bash away the exterior cladding of a building to expose all the structural stuff underneath that's harder to dislodge, because that's how buildings work. Even as you acquire more weird and destructive weapons throughout the game, the signature hammer wound up being my go-to. Chopping down buildings with horizontal swings like a lumberjack was fun all the way to the end. But take a step back. Hop in a big heavy vehicle like an EDF hauler, get it up to speed, and ram it straight into a building. That's beautiful. That's art. I wish the game set you up for that more often, but it likes placing low-slung barriers around so many of its most complex structures, which will stop your wheeled wrecking ball nearly every time. To compensate, it sometimes sets you up with a cast of walkers and exosuits to stomp around in. Of course, like nearly every other Havoc-enhanced game of this era, you'll find that enemies and friends alike will ragdoll in incredible ways once you impact them too. The most hilariously off-putting part of this game's destruction system becomes apparent pretty quickly. Like the older games, it's quick and easy to knock out a structure's supports and witness anything above it just sit there floating, cantilevered in the air, evidence of the limitations of the interconnectivity between the Geomod damage system, the Havoc physics engine, and also probably the hardware powering it all. As a building's second or third story hangs there in the air unsupported, you'll hear the twisting and mewling of metals and the rumblings of a structure about to collapse, but it'll just stand there as the game calculates how it's going to let this building fall down. So many times you'll encounter a target that is being rigidly held up, unaffected by a sliver of metal. It's weird when this happens to bigger structures, but it'll happen with smaller stuff too, like this billboard. Knocking stuff down in this game is incredibly fun, but over time your easy ability to demolish crates and walls and entire city halls builds the mental notion that nearly all of these structures are made of little more than firm butter, which melts away easily beneath your hammer swings and explosive charges. It's really fun to manually bulldoze an entire house in less than 60 seconds, but it also feels weird that these are the permanent structures that people use to live and work in. It was an odd feeling that diminished the value of not just these individual structures, but these towns and settlements entirely, especially since they're laid out so sparsely and they seem to feature hard caps on structural complexity. How could this society possibly exist if one dude with a hammer and enough time to microwave a cup of ramen could completely dismantle an entire government's function or a small population's entire place of residence? It made the drama lighter, it made the EDF's encroaching space death ray less of a threat. It made the game feel more empty and pointless. Visually, the game isn't terribly impressive or exciting. I'd say it's even kind of boring to look at, which is a strange artistic choice considering how visually crisp and vibrant the Saints Row games were. Or even Red Faction 2. Guerrilla doesn't look bad, it just looks like a video game adaptation of a cable TV science fiction show, which is interesting because we'll get to that. The cutscenes of the remastered release, which is a weirdly forced pun, come on guys, are warm and smudgy, clearly ripped from the original 2009 release, warts and all. Then you're dumped into the real world of Mars, which is dramatically sharper, but repetitive to look at. Mars just kinda slides off your eyeballs. Anyway, similar to my criticism of the original game, this was an era of visually dominant earth tones and grays as games became more realistic. Guerrilla adheres obediently to the mundane, borderline monochromatic look of the game's largely undeveloped, barren landscape. Each of Mars's 6 sectors are distinguished by their uniquely colored haze, which is genuinely helpful because they're often difficult to tell apart at a glance otherwise. The planet may have been terraformed, but it still carries much of its dusty terrain and similarly muted skies. It's not until most of the way through the game that it presents more colorful, visually distinctive Earth-like terrain with green vegetation, or the snowy disposition of the northerly Eos sector. Eos is a kind of affluent, Swiss-like mountain village with tons of large, elaborate pedestrian tunnels, some very informal public transit across really rough roads, and municipal art. It's my favorite sector in the game. Open world games require turbulent terrain to manage the player and establish fun systems of traversal. If the whole world is just a flat glacial sheet, you can see and immediately walk to points of interest without challenge. That's boring. So games like Far Cry, Fallout, and Just Cause mix it up. When raw landscapes with hills and vegetation aren't as palatable or appropriate, games like Grand Theft Auto, Spider-Man, and Saints Row utilize the building blocks of cities instead. Guerrilla's Mars colony doesn't resemble the tightness of some futuristic city, but the sparseness of a rural countryside. so the game pushes you to work and play in a rough landscape of fiercely exaggerated terrain and hostile elevation changes. The first 2 sectors are especially turbulent, placing points of interest in the chasms between hilly fingers. An objective may only be a virtual stone's throw away when you start in Parker, but getting to it requires a minute or 2 by truck because the terrain is too steep to cross by foot. It both lengthens the amount of playtime in each sector, but it also cages the area where your destructive madness is going to be simulated on. But that's just speculation on my part. The game's third sector, the Badlands, finally presents some relative flatness, but after 2 sectors of tight winding roads and uncrossable ridges, it feels a little too open. The space is so large that its fringes feel like they're revealing undercooked parts of the map. Exploring these portions feels like the earliest days of 3D open world games, like you're wandering through the back rooms of the world unintentionally. One of these places is the Free Fire Zone. It's the only place I noticed terrain tiling in the game. Speaking of which, I mentioned earlier that there are 6 sectors to procedurally liberate, but there's really only 5. The Free Fire Zone is a region you rush through in a mission to avoid the EDF's powerful artillery that's liberated by taking out a small cluster of military targets in the end. Like any open world game, there are lots of dead-headed settlers and drivers that fill the void to make it feel like a virtual community, but they feel especially strange here considering the setting. Civilians will drive into clearly dangerous war zones, and as you reach the bougier sectors of Oasis and Eos, they do so in futuristic civilian cars, which is a bit of a tonal mismatch. Fun fact, if you steal a car, it's not a violent act. You approach it, initiate entry, and the driver happily hands you the keys, encouraging you to bring it back in one piece. Red Faction is a series that has made establishing and connecting with other characters a low priority, so it's a relief that Guerrilla features the highest fidelity set of people to hang out with and take missions from so far. These characters aren't confined to piping in snippets of exposition over the radio. Unfortunately, there are 2 of them. Besides the squads of helpful guerrillas who spawn alongside you when you kick off some violence, the game tries not to make you feel like you're shouldering the burden of being Mars's liberator alone like the original game did. But unlike their Saints Row games, it doesn't feel like you have a posse or group of people to hang out with. By limiting nearly all of your character's personal interactions to a pair of other characters, it makes the world feel so much smaller, even though it's larger than it's ever been. Alec Mason has literally one line with the game's big bad antagonist, a villain who is only seen twice in the entire game. I don't even remember his name, he's so forgettable. I mean, he's bald, I remember that, but so is everyone else in this game. Actually, everyone here seems to have really round heads too. Huh. Still, I can't help but wonder how great it would have been to introduce a new permanent character as you reach each new sector, culminating in an army of personalities that rally alongside you and your battalions of automated guerrillas as you scale up the mountain in the game's final push. Other games implement schemes like this, but Guerrilla seem to pass for some reason, making this Mars feel strangely empty. As you can tell, Guerrilla pulls the camera out to the third person, a huge change for the series that gives you a better scope on the damage you're inflicting, especially with the hammer. It also works effectively when getting into and out of vehicles, although I wish the in-vehicle camera weren't so close to the butt of whatever vehicle you're driving. I swear the camera wasn't this close when I played the game back in the day. Each sector features a safe house where you can buy and upgrade your weapons, or change your 4-slot loadout. You'll spawn from the closest one of these when you die, and as you progress, this obviously becomes more unpredictable. Unfortunately, some of these safe houses are spread a little too thinly. When you reach the vast expanse of the Badlands, you'll find that you're spawning on the fringe of a huge empty space, and then driving across a lot of nothing to get to a mission or a target. Thankfully, each safe house makes at least one vehicle available because you're not walking anywhere. When you knock down most buildings, scrap materializes, which serves as your upgrade currency. Despite a red animated sheen, scrap tends to blend into the rubble, so thankfully one of the first abilities you can buy allows you to scoop it up while in a vehicle, rather than having to hop out and grab it by hand. On top of your weapons and their upgrades, you have backpacks that give you special abilities, like a tactical X-ray vision, healing on demand, or vertical mobility with a jetpack. Switching between these packs requires accessing the long list of weapon upgrades for some reason. They really needed their own menu. Alongside your hammer, you can chuck and plant charges that you remotely detonate, an essential tool for bringing down bigger structures. Upgrading this as quickly as possible becomes necessary. Only being able to plant 2 charges at a time in the tutorial was frustrating. You may forget that you have to take up regular-ass guns against human opponents in this game, and it seems Volition might have too, because gunplay is a weird bit of a miss, mirroring my issues with their Saints Row games. Aiming and shooting feels fine. The weapons are maybe the best set in the series, except for the grinder, which spits out spinning saw blades. It feels useless. But enemies don't seem to visually react to your weaponry. After absorbing enough rounds, they just kind of fall over. You also don't get much ammo to work with, even with upgrades, so you're constantly scrambling to find one-time use ammo crates or pick up ammo and weaponry off your dead enemies. It sucks. You are constantly short for ammo for all of your weapons in this game. There's also the mandatory cover mechanic and left stick zoom that seemed more necessary with a controller than a mouse. The game's twisty, high contrast terrain necessitates a lot of the driving that you'll be doing, which is a lot, all the time, across vast, featureless lengths following a guide ribbon. The loosey-goosey vehicle physics don't play well when the terrain restricts into tighter canyons, causing you to nick corners that cause your vehicle to flip up into the air or get spun around. It doesn't help that you'll launch into the air when there's no apparent obstacle that caused it at all. The couple of times you'll have to chase targets along cliff edges show little mercy. When you inevitably roll your vehicle, it's very difficult to right it without hopping out and flipping it over by hand. Games like Halo or Grand Theft Auto alleviate this by having mid-air rollback controls, even if it's unrealistic. This game also features mid-air rollback controls, but it's far more subtle, so you'll still wind up hopping out and resetting it by hand most of the time. There was one unique moment in the town of Dust where the GPS guide ribbon has you ducking into a canyon alongside a bridge rather than crossing the bridge itself when en route to a mission or while on one. This is presumably because they didn't want to have 2 separate GPS routes for before and after you've blown up that bridge in an important mission. If you've played any open world game, you know what to expect here. Guerrilla's map is filled with icons indicating primary and secondary missions, as well as high-value military targets to smash for scrap and dramatic action. The work to extinguish these icons becomes an interesting mix of missions that work hard to exploit open-world gaming tropes and the dynamics of Volition's technology. The game's main story missions are more complex, often multi-stage affairs that drive the narrative, advance your rebellious cause, and dole out new gameplay mechanics. Each sector has a bigger, longer one of these at the end that allows you to liberate it, granting you access to the next sector, which unlock in a linear fashion, broadly speaking. Guerrilla actions are the specific name given to the secondary and far more common means by which you drain EDF influence from a sector and build support for your cause, noted by individual ratings on the map. These in turn unlock those headlining story missions. Several of these were clearly inspired by the absurd side quests they built for their Saints Row games, minus a good bit of the actual absurdity that would yank you out of this game's more conservative realism. These missions are plentiful, but thankfully don't need to be 100%ed to advance because they can also become incredibly tedious, especially after clearing a few sectors. Here are a few. Assaults pair you with some AI guerrillas to whittle down mobs of EDF troops in offensive or defensive positions, tracked by a pendulous meter that reveals the tide of the action. House arrests hand you a vehicle and a place where sympathizers are being held hostage. You need to relieve them of their bindings and safely bring them back to your safe house. These are interesting opportunities to complete a mission by any means possible, whether it's running and gunning through the front door or smashing a truck through the rear wall near the hostages and freeing them that way. Demolition Master Challenges give you a handful of specific weapons to blow up a target structure within a time limit, and they're fun, puzzly experiments. Timed vehicle sprints are annoying as hell because using the prescribed route won't typically get you to the destination in time. Victory will often require you to find and memorize shortcuts wherever possible. Of course, this is aggravated by the finicky dynamics I mentioned earlier, where your performance is held hostage between your vehicle's physics model and the wildly variable terrain. You can even hop in with one of the group's redneck terraphobes as he carts you around on a turret bike thing, allowing you to blow up EDF structures along a fixed route. This is fun, but there are times where it felt like I was inflicting the same amount of damage across multiple runs and coming up with some wildly different damage ratings. I think a huge chunk of that is just related to how dynamic destruction is and how it can cascade in different ways. Then there's the tiny stuff that don't get map icons, like knocking out EDF supply crates, knocking down propaganda billboards, and mining crystal and ore deposits. You know, the flavor tasks. As you gain influence in sectors, guerrillas will join your cause and fight alongside you. By the time you reach Eos, the final sector, there's enough people helping you out that it does start to feel like you've become a sizable force. Combat engagements begin to feel like actual battlefronts rather than tiny improvised skirmishes. A lot of it does feel like a smoke show, however. These men and women die easily, don't seem to inflict much damage on enemies, and depending on the color filter of the sector I was fighting in, often ended up dead by my own hand because I often mistook them for EDF troops. Thankfully, the game doesn't punish you for this inevitable error. On the flip side, de-escalation with the EDF is particularly difficult because there are so few places to hide from their influence. Whether you're on a full destructive campaign or you just bumped into one of their vehicles, your threat meter lights up to a peak throbbing red pretty easily. In the worst case scenario, EDF troops seem to pour in ceaselessly in waves, like a wound that doesn't stop gushing blood. Starting any mission requires full de-escalation, so if I'd done anything even approaching offensive to the occupying force, it was typically easier to be mowed down by them and drive in from the safe house, however far it was, than it was to try and find a place where they couldn't spawn on me or walk up to me. Outside of the campaign are standalone wrecking crew and multiplayer options, but good luck finding anyone to play with these days. As Guerrilla's main story winds to a conclusion, your ponytailed colleague Samanya reveals that she was once a marauder. This would have carried some dramatic weight if they'd established the marauders better. Volition delegated this drama to the game's lone story expansion DLC, Demons of the Badlands, detailing how the marauders came to be and how Samanya and her sister Vasha led the raider group ahead of the events of the main game. Demons takes place in the standalone Mariner Valley, a sector that's disconnected from the main game, so any progress you make here doesn't carry over, and vice versa. It doesn't have quite the cinematic heft or production values of the main game, existing in an era before games took these kinds of narrative expansions seriously. You can beat this episode in just over an hour if you want to beat the story quests, and a half hour longer if you want to make sure everything's blowed up real good. By all means, this DLC is a 7th disconnected sector for this game. Since Samanya was the upgrade goddess in the main game and you now play as her, there's no scrap or currency to acquire as you knock down structures. You unlock a handful of weapons and augmentations as you complete missions. Speaking of which, the final mission involves freeing Daniel Mason and Red Faction commander Hugo Davies from EDF's prisons before Vasha's campaign of vengeance nearly gets them all killed. My favorite addition in this DLC is the Spiker gun, which doesn't seem like much, but it allows you to one-shot dudes, and it has a large ammo capacity, so you're not anxiously scrounging for it like you are in the base game. Demons is fun, I guess. More accurately, I should say it's more. If you made it through all of Guerrilla and just absolutely felt the thirsty desire deep in your gut for more of the game's specific brand of destructive action with more side quests, then this content is probably for you. Honestly, I don't think this was some big group of people. Because this isn't connected to the main game, I felt absolutely no motivation to knock out any of the remaining structures or finish the remainder of the quests once I'd beaten the expansion's final story mission. Since this DLC seems to be packed in with every copy of Guerrilla you can buy digitally now, I mean, why not give it a peek, I guess? Having played it for this review for the first time, I certainly don't feel a shred of remorse for having not played it in the 14 years prior, so enjoy, maybe, I guess? Before I give my conclusion on Guerrilla, Patreon producer James, Just a Bald Guy Wyatt, has some thoughts. When I played it way back when, I remember being enamored with the massive hammer and destroying as much as I could. I rarely used any weapons besides the hammer and remote charges. Pummeling dudes never got old. Unfortunately, in larger frays I was often stun-locked and ragdolled around while trying to destroy whatever it was I was destroying. I went from full health to dead in seconds, which greatly diminished my enjoyment of the game as it happened so frequently. 15 years and 2 console generations after it released, Red Faction Guerrilla is still a really fun game, easily my favorite in the series. Guerrilla nailed the possibility of geomod in 2009 when its predecessors merely hinted at it. There's something magical about how the game allows you to, essentially, take your big hammer and procedurally smash a 4-story building to rubble. It's clear that so much of the game's structure is inspired by Saints Row, which makes sense because they made those games and those games were successful. Why wouldn't you? But there are things lost in the translation from the Saints Row model that Geomod 2.0 destruction can't quite compensate for. Guerrilla's more serious tone eliminates some of the more ridiculous and fun quests. There's no cooperative mode in here, there's no vehicle, weapon, or character customization. There's no verticality, the list goes on. Guerrilla is a lot of fun, but by the time I reached the vast expanse of the Badlands, destroying stuff started to feel like a chore to push the story forward. By the time the credits rolled, my heart was definitely done with this game, which is exactly how I felt when I completed it in 2009. The game kept my attention with its experiments in destruction. It was great when I dusted off my charge throwing chops or my horizontal versus vertical hammer swings to take out the old Red Faction headquarters by hand. Or there was the late game Demolitions Master mission where you've got a pair of thermobaric rockets and a nano rifle to destroy an incomplete building, something that nearly stumped me 15 years ago. Nearby, there's a mission where you need to take out snipers who are camped out in an office complex. The possibility space for these mechanics is massive, but there are plenty of times where the game isn't letting you smash things up, or Geomod takes a back seat, like the final march up the mountain to take out the EDF once and for all. When the game leans heavily on its driving or its gunplay, it's like leaning on a weak limb. It's more cinematic than ever, but the second game's dirty half dozen would have been such an incredible inclusion and splash of life here. Like the Minecraft alpha that surfaced as a Java applet around the same time that this game landed on store shelves, Guerrilla teases an incredible universe of destructive possibility, one that only seems limited in this game by the technology of the time and the premise of the franchise itself. Reviewing games requires the critic to understand that they're evaluating what the product is and not what it isn't. Guerrilla teases so many possibilities, but then stops short in fully exploiting them. It's hard not to play armchair game designer when you see how much fun they left on the table to focus on the mundane elements that did make it into the game, that made it thematically compatible with the earlier games in the franchise. In retrospect, it feels a little too safe and conservative in its design, like a boring minivan built on top of a supercar chassis and drivetrain. 6 years later, we'd see Geomod's potential amplified when Microsoft showed off the cloud-powered destruction of early Crackdown 3 prototypes. They showed off unprecedented structural carnage with complex urban skyscrapers toppling over completely during the course of a multiplayer match. Let's never mind that such a demo was unsustainable. Microsoft wasn't going to spin up 20 servers per multiplayer match to simulate the destruction of a fictional sci-fi city. The demo may have never actually been fun to play, but that kind of destruction in that kind of dense, urban setting tickled the exact nerve that Guerrilla revealed that we needed tickling. Guerrilla seemed like it was a success by all measures, effectively resurrecting the franchise. So a Guerrilla 2 that drafted on Geomod's newly tapped potential alongside more creative and engaging content seemed like a slam dunk and the most obvious way forward, right? Right?
Red Faction, 85 Metacritic game. Last one really good. Gamers love it. The next one blows the whole world out. If there were angles on the other one we polished everything.
So if you're THQ, how do you follow up on Red Faction Guerrilla? Well, you push a dream of a transmedia empire where Red Faction expands beyond gaming into movies and comic books to take root with the broadest audience possible. If you embrace one format and like it, you'll want to engage with it elsewhere, right? This was the dream of Danny Bilson, THQ's executive vice president for core games, which were the in-house IPs, the non-licensed stuff. You have to remember that THQ, if you can remember THQ at all at this point, was known for and made its bread and butter with its licensed games. When you saw SpongeBob, Bratz, WWE, Shark Tale, The Incredibles, and a lot more on store shelves through the 90s and the aughts, chances are there was a THQ badge in the corner. Bilson arrived at THQ in 2008 as licensed games were going out of style, and it became his charge to help THQ enhance its own original games. He's maybe best known as having co-written The Rocketeer, which was one of my favorite movies as a kid. It's still pretty great as an adult, too. Simply releasing another Red Faction game wouldn't be enough in 2011. This was the future. Bilson wanted to go big. He had a lot of film industry experience, but he arrived a little too late to enact his Hollywood-tinged dream for Guerrilla. For Red Faction Armageddon, Volition's next big game in the series, THQ partnered with cable TV channel Syfy to create a TV pilot called Red Faction Origins that would bridge the events of the two games. Meanwhile, THQ's Digital Studios UK was tasked with developing Red Faction Battlegrounds, a multiplayer-only arena battler for Xbox Live Arcade and the PlayStation Network. Red Faction Battlegrounds is the spitting image of what a downloadable game was in the aughts, a tiny game with an itty-bitty scope made by an itsy-bitsy team. Before all games became downloadable, this was the realm of indie games from bedroom developers. But for established video game publishers, it was the ideal place for a cheap, focused, function-specific experience to augment an existing intellectual property, like the Toyota Yaris. Borrowing vehicles and assets from Red Faction Guerrilla, Battlegrounds is a top-down vehicle shooter with tiny, windy arenas. Props to THQ Digital Studios UK for making these spaces navigable and fast here when Volition couldn't over there in Guerrilla. It's vital to maintaining the quick pace of the game and, no doubt, ensures players don't get bunched up. These arenas are small, like they could fit on a tabletop, and the camera has a really wide lens that gives the game a very default video game look. Diligently following your vehicle is essential because these arenas are so visually busy that it's easy to lose your avatar. Complementing that is the busy static interface with the system default fonts that was common of the era and very ugly. This is such a lightly developed game that there are no cinematics, and the training missions don't even feature any voiceover. It feels really good to move vehicles around in this game, and intuitively, projectiles will arc over terrain to hit distant targets. This is a great feature because it's hard to judge elevation. It looks and feels like a lot of games of its size and genre, like Renegade Ops, a similar tiny experiment from Just Cause developer Avalanche Studios. But that game at least had a single-player campaign that could also be played cooperatively with a friend locally, in split screen, or with up to 3 other players online. All of this game's value hinges on being a fun multiplayer experience. The value of that, of course, hinges on having other people to play with. Unfortunately, good luck finding anyone to play with these days. The only single-player content here is the absurdly long series of training missions. It's such an exhausting tutorial that it wouldn't surprise me that some significant portion of players gave up on the game entirely before they came close to finishing it. Beyond that, there are no bot matches either. It's not likely that I'd never heard of this game before committing to this series review, but having exhausted nearly all of its available content in most of an hour, it didn't surprise me that I had forgotten about it entirely. Contemporary reviews were not kind to Battlegrounds, but its individual failure shouldn't matter too much considering it's a singular tine on this transmedia fork, right? Hoo boy. Red Faction Origins wasn't created exclusively to promote THQ's upcoming game. The 2011 made-for-TV movie was a product of mutual convenience. Bilson cheered to VentureBeat that their deal with Syfy was one based on trade. That is, no money changed hands. Syfy got access to the Red Faction IP to produce Origins and potentially launch a new TV series that they owned with an existing fanbase of Red Faction fans. In turn, THQ got to stamp a Syfy Games logo on the splash screens of both Red Faction Battlegrounds and Armageddon, even though there was no such entity as Syfy Games. Both sides got to look cool, I guess. Origins takes place 25 years after Guerrilla and 25 years before Armageddon in the year 2150, which reflects Red Faction's tongue-in-cheek consideration of time. Guerrilla protagonist Alec Mason is an old man now, portrayed by B-movie regular Robert Patrick. I know Patrick best not as the liquid metal villain of Terminator 2, but as Mission Commander Boston Lowe from LucasArts' 1996 adventure game, The Dig. Anyway, Alec's son Jake is the protagonist here, and Jake's son Darius is the hero of Armageddon, the game that launched alongside this TV movie. It seems like a clever setup, but It's a lot to take in at once, if you're literally taking it all in at once, which I did. The movie opens by using some of Guerrilla's cutscenes diegetically to explain the events of that game for those who presumably hadn't played it. What they don't explain, because it's the mystery at the center of this film's high-quality plot, is that EDF forces still on Mars when the Red Faction nuked the EDS Hydra went into hiding and spent the decades afterwards building a warship underground, somehow, without anyone noticing, to strike back at the Red Faction. Creatively, these nefarious villains are called the White Faction. When a chunk of the Hydra falls to Mars, they loot it for a MacGuffin called a firework, so they can start up their ship's fusion reactor and get it out of the ground to enact their big evil plan. I had originally written out the entire plot of the movie to contextualize a few things, but I decided against it because it'll just make both of us more frustrated. There's a flashback ambush sequence that looks ripped from a Law and Order episode. And then there's the fact that both Jake and Myra Mason, the sister who was kidnapped by the White Faction and presumed dead, recognize each other as brother and sister easily, despite not having seen each other in decades. Guys, I'm not afraid to admit that I have friends I failed to recognize in person because I hadn't seen them in a year and they had grown out a beard or they wore a hat. Lore-wise, this serves as a decent end cap to Guerrilla, but it doesn't do a whole lot to support Armageddon. It meekly introduces Adam Hale, the big bad of the next game, as well as the EDF's terraformer, the legged spire that ensures Martian weather doesn't destroy human civilization on the planet. But that's about it. Maybe if this had been popular enough to be picked up for series, they might have expanded on that. And before you get too excited, because I did, Robert Patrick sacrifices himself in the end to blow up the White Faction's ship. So it's hard to say where the story would have gone from there without the White Faction, or how watchable it would have been without a depressed, drunk Robert Patrick starting bar fights. Unfortunately for us, Syfy and THQ, this is an aggressively mediocre 88-minute TV movie. It's not bad, or even so bad it's good. Watching it is just an irritatingly unproductive amount of time. If it were just offensively bad, it'd be much easier to feel something about it. In an era before prestige TV or the elevation of Syfy's ambitions with The Expanse years later, this was clearly produced on the absolute cheap. Syfy is barely trying to make this look authentic to the series, as though it's cosplaying the games, which look like Hollywood tentpoles in comparison. Based on the setting and the crew names, this was shot in Eastern Europe and on Earth, with brick walls and modern settings you don't see in the games. The sets look cheap, and the vehicles, props, and locations reflect whatever modern Earth assets they had access to, not the futuristic ones from the games. Presumably because they'd have to pay to fabricate those. Actually, there is a light truck in here that looks like something from Oasis, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was just an odd European vehicle they had lying around. Red Faction armor looks like kit-bashed athletic padding, while the White Faction look like they're wearing tailored food service uniforms. The special effects are bad, with CGI sequences that look like cutscenes from 1999's Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun. The green screening is bad, the composites are bad, it's just the quality of what they were making back then. The sound effects are laughable too, like someone just dropped in some WAVs from the 1000 sound effects value software they bought at Best Buy in 1998. And then there's the film craft itself, which leans heavily on medium shots, bad jokes, and weird direction. The dialogue is stilted and overly expository because they feel obligated to cover a lot of ground in attracting a whole new audience to this series. I'll close with this. When Jake and his coworker Tess get captured and wind up in a White Faction jail cell, Origins has the absolutely corny idea to lure in a guard and have Tess distract them with nudity so Jake can incapacitate them and they can flee. It's the scene you write when you're a 13-year-old boy. Jake causes a ruckus to summon the guard. The door opens to reveal one, a female guard. Tess still flashes them, but the guard, in a single fluid movement, ignores Tess and goes straight to fight Jake, who's supposed to be out of sight. It is one of the most awkward scenes of movie direction I've ever seen. It's mind-boggling to me that Bilson would champion such a low-quality and low-effort transmedia undertaking between Battlegrounds and Origins to bolster Red Faction Armageddon and the franchise as a whole. Battlegrounds was panned by critics upon release and immediately forgotten. Syfy's Origins is a cheap, formulaic, and badly written movie that barely offends, but also barely exists. After all that work, it's hard to argue it had any kind of productive, positive effect, considering Armageddon would wind up with middling reviews and terrible sales. The concept of transmedia properties, of experiencing a narrative through a variety of different ways, is neat, but there are usually a couple problems with the concept and execution. In trying to nail a target release window, different components may be undercooked. The big transmedia experiment that was the second Matrix film, alongside The Animatrix and The Path of Neo, as ambitious and nearly overwhelming as it was a mixed bag. It also splits the fiction in a self-justifying way to entice you to experience the whole burrito, with some strange moments in one part that refer to another part you may not have experienced yet. If you were just playing Armageddon and hadn't watched Origins, you'd know even less about the game's villain, which is already not a lot. While researching this series, I struggled to remember where I'd heard of Bilson before. And then it came to me. Polygon's long-form piece about the Red Dawn-inspired action shooter Homefront, another THQ Core release that struggled in development hell for years before releasing to lukewarm reviews and disappointing commercial receipts. According to employees at that game's developer, Kaos Studios, Bilson was an inconsistent micromanaging interloper. He'd landed the studio to pitch what may have been ultimately good tweaks and ideas, but ones that forced Kaos to scrap tons of work. The game's plot features a foreign nation successfully invading America and the subsequent change to domestic life as a result. According to game developer, it was Bilson that suggested that North Korea be the invading army, something the team scoffed at considering how implausible that was. We can only speculate about how Bilson's role swayed key creative decisions within the Red Faction series. Considering the failure of not just Red Faction's transmedia experiment, but the failure of Bilson's portfolio overall at THQ, it really raises questions about how Red Faction Armageddon came to be, the game that has, for over a decade now, served as the final entry in this saga.
Alright, let's get out of here. Turret is primed and ready, hop on. There we go. Stay frosty.
That's supposed to be funny.
Like Red Faction 2 nearly a decade prior, Red Faction Armageddon is a bizarre 90-degree pivot from its predecessor. By ditching Guerrilla's newly acquired open world and all the stuff that goes with it, it forfeits many of that game's accomplishments. Like an unnecessary retreat or a strange admission of weakness, Armageddon returns to the series' roots by readopting the corridor shooter format that the original games utilized with questionable results, because that's all they really had at the time. Armageddon retains the third-person camera of its immediate predecessor, but saves its vehicles for specifically designed combat sections, again, like its ancestors. It's such a drastic departure gameplay-wise that subverts the expectations of any new fans that Guerrilla acquired, which was no doubt many of the people who were anticipating Armageddon. This is such a twist that, you even lose the hammer from the previous game in the logo, which was such an important symbol for the franchise. I'm not against drastic creative choices or changes, but this was such a bizarre series of choices. But Volition and THQ aren't quite done twisting the putty knife yet. Armageddon also sheds Guerrilla's persistent sunlight and day as night setting for the darkness of underground caverns and dusk raids. And it's not just that it's dark, it's that it becomes a horror game entirely, with freaky bug enemies and hellish levels. It adopts a real Gears of War or Resident Evil vibe in that process, because they wanted to? Somehow, internally at Volition, they wanted to make a horror game with geomod tech. Was this really their secret burning desire? But let's dial back the weirdness a second. What's at the core of Red Faction? It's geomod. It's about blowing holes in walls and digging tunnels and all that other stuff that technology allows for. But didn't Volition already come to the conclusion that dynamic destruction isn't really compatible with the corridor shooter format? Okay, so what is Volition going to do differently here to make it work this time? Armageddon lets you blow stuff up, the granularity of which we'll discuss in a bit, but its big mechanical gimmick is the ability to build stuff. If you destroy a bridge, you can use your nanoforge to restore it to its original condition. As the previews and ads rolled out, rebuilding stuff seemed like a gimmick, but playing it, its usefulness became entirely obvious and completely necessary. But here's another twist, one even I didn't expect. When this game can get out of its own way, it winds up being a more consistent action game moment to moment than its predecessor. Unfortunately, it doesn't get quite enough opportunities to shine. For housekeeping purposes, one last time, I bought the Steam version of this game, but it's so freaking ugly in 4K on a PC when it was never intended to be run that way, I decided to also buy the Xbox 360 version with the expansion, not realizing that the Xbox 360 marketplace was closing after nearly 20 years. By the time you watch this, you won't be able to purchase any of these games for play on an actual Xbox 360, but you will be able to do so on the Xbox consoles released since then. In Armageddon, you played Darius Mason, grandson of Alec Mason, the hammer-swinging protagonist of Guerrilla during literally brighter days. You've already met Darius's dad, Jake. Actually, no you haven't. No one watched Origins. As the opening tutorial chapter reveals, our new Mason is part of a more regimented and professional Red faction than the one his grandpappy wound up leading. Their aesthetic resembles Gears of War's coalition of governments with the same gunmetal gray science fiction armor. Your goal is to stop Adam Hale, now a tattooed cultist weirdo who is trying to destroy the terraformer for a second time. Yes, a second time, because I'm trying to spare you from any more Origins callbacks. This terrible deed would force humans on Mars underground to avoid the instability of the Martian atmosphere. Darius is yet another meat-headed doofus whose primary trait, besides being a demolitions engineer and fulfilling the franchise's prophecy, is to keep getting tricked into doing stuff incredibly easily. Inside the terraformer, he uncritically skips over Hale, who has costumed himself in a Red faction uniform. With Mason's back turned, Hale disables the terraformer, forcing humans on Mars underground to avoid the newly hazardous atmosphere. These people fled to Bastion, their new cave town home. Years later, on a job deep underground, Mason uncaps what anyone remotely familiar with science fiction would recognize as a big, evil thing that you shouldn't meddle with. This reintroduces an ancient evil plague into the world that Ultor's Axel Capek had sealed off before the events of the first game nearly a century prior. Oh, and here's the series' final Capek reference. They even gave the evil gremlin a hologram. This alien plague became the obsession of a throng of marauders turned cultists that Hale falls in with, and now they want to summon it back into the world. Remember, marauders are descendants of the Ultor researchers who knew these critters existed. I'm keeping track of the lore so you don't have to. Over the course of the next few hours, Darius darts in and out of Bastion, tasked with restoring its life support systems as they fail, while watching a crowd grow more suspicious of him for unleashing this plague. When it finally overruns Bastion, that crowd has morphed into an angry mob who want him dead for causing this mess, which he did, because he's an idiot. He still denies it though.
It's not what you think. Were you there or not? Look, it was supposed to be a drill job, that's all. It was an accident. Come on now, you all know me.
The campaign then becomes taking out Hale, then destroying the alien plague entirely, including its queen, and rebuilding the terraformer. Apparently the alien plague really doesn't like air, even though there's enough air still left in the atmosphere after the disabling of the terraformer for people to still live in and work. The game doesn't really explain stuff like that. It's a bit B-movie-ish in that way. Like the original game, you're single-handedly accomplishing nearly everything in your campaign, but you now have a digital assistant, Sam. They explain things around you, but over the course of the game, they mutate into a grating presence with irritating quips that spark cringy exchanges with Darius.
Marauder Shiva squads detected. Cultist reinforcements detected. Cultist vehicles detected.
Would you just stop detecting?
Yay, thanks Joss Whedon, somehow. Armageddon's relentless darkness makes it difficult to see much of anything in this game, including your way through these intentionally constrictive and often labyrinthine underground settings. Needless to say, you'll find yourself stumbling in the dark a lot. Your flashlight is involuntarily toggled on and off in the absolute darkest corners, which usually isn't an issue. But there's a lot of this game where it feels like you don't have a full scope of your location or orientation. The setting does allow for an interesting adaptation though. Ammo pickups are portrayed with floating lights that project an icon of what the ammo is, which is super neat. I don't know who flipped what levers in THQ's budget office, but Armageddon feels very high budget relative to its peers and predecessors. It never rises to the stature of a AAA game, but it looks and sounds like the series' first premium game. Like, there wasn't too much they had to compromise along the way in a series that feels like it's been constantly hindered by them. There were also plenty of times where I was surprised that this was an Xbox 360 game because it looked so pretty, as opposed to Guerrilla, which was softer, beigeur, and definitely not as handsome. The UI looked sharper and more refined than Guerrilla's, but there's some unfortunate graphical cruft here, like this stylized nonsense around highlight reticles or in-menu pop-ups that are just distracting. You do get a cool new radar that indicates where enemies are and whether they're above or below you, which becomes vital considering the verticality of this game. You'd think this would all work well to enable the game's horror ambitions, but what it really did was make me feel bored, even depressed, in a way that Guerrilla's visual tedium didn't. Cataloging this footage is one of the most boring things I've ever had to do. What may have been an interesting series of locations to play through in the moment becomes a boring, indistinguishable parade of shadowy locales on review. I genuinely feel sorry for you guys watching this and not just listening to it in the next room as you fold laundry or do the dishes or whatever. I'm doing my best though. Before we get too deep into this, let me tell you about the most clever thing this game does, something I've never seen in any other game. As the game starts, it asks you to tilt your controller stick to look up. Depending on how you respond, pulling the stick up or down, it automatically toggles standard or inverted view settings. That's incredibly clever. Despite being a direct descendant of Guerrilla gameplay-wise, Armageddon leans heavily on its combat and blowing up bugs, rather than smashing up buildings made of wet crackers. What felt like a 50-50 split between bashing structures and shooting faces has shifted so it's now more like 10-90 in favor of shooting faces. Bug faces. It made me wonder why they didn't switch back to the first-person camera. Shifting the action formula back to something that resembles the older games obliterates the need for the franchise's iconic tool, the sledgehammer. I mean, I just quipped that they removed it from the logo for this game, which is now just a busy word mark, but I never actually needed it. You do wind up destroying a few structures throughout the game, yes, but the game gives you other destructive options that are also compatible with blowing up swarms of bugs. And look, this is still a Red Faction game. Destroying the environment is still an essential part of the experience and the brands, but you don't have a big open world to blow stuff up in anymore. This is a corridor shooter now, so like, what's going on in this game? Imagine, if you will, taking the complexity and the destructible geometry of one of Guerrilla's sprawled out bases and origami folding it into a narrow canyon. That's what levels in this game feel like. Mirroring the game's nerfing of the hammer, you get a gun that lets you shoot sticky explosive charges out of a barrel before you press X to detonate them all. This is more intuitive, interesting, and fun than the old hand chuck you were doing in Guerrilla. You'll find that many of the man-made fixtures of a level, stairs, supports, ramps, and more, are destructible, something we're familiar with. The game also includes standalone structures to destroy, something we're also familiar with. But then you have the part where you don't destroy stuff, you build it. But why? Sounds like a gimmick to me. The Nanoforge is a very powerful tool in this game like it was in the last game, but I'm not sure how Darius was entrusted with it because it's such a rare piece of technology. But then how did they recover it from the destruction of the EDS Hydra when it was in that rocket? Did they have the blueprint and replicate it? So why are you the only one with this tool? What if repairing stuff became this game's big marketing point after Guerrilla was exclusively about smashing things over and over again because repairing stuff is vital in this game. It allows you to reform walls for cover, bridges for access, stairs for stepping, etc. You also get a repair grenade you can toss to repair distant targets because your repair ability has a very short range. Since these levels are just corridors again, it's easy to get, let's just say, sloppy with your destructive tools and knock out mission-critical structures, especially when you're doing the combat thing and fighting the monster bugs. If you weren't able to rebuild these features, you could easily softlock your progress. I know that was a big feature of the original game, but we don't actually want it here. Beyond not holding up your progress, there are smaller applications for rebuilding stuff too. One of the most frustrating things in the game is falling through a tiny hole in the floor you can't see. This is a common feature because everything is so freaking dark in this game all the time. And then sometimes even the inventory and upgrade stations will get blown up, so you'll have to rebuild those to use them. But wait, there's more! Beyond letting you repair the environment, the Nanoforge allows you to push enemies and blow open obstacles, which is another new tool that eliminates the need for the hammer. You can even add other abilities, like a defensive bubble shield that's super helpful when tenderizing bug swarms. But you may be wondering, what about the gunplay, the most important thing you need to blast tons of bugs? Thankfully, the moment-to-moment blasting is enhanced over Guerrilla, feeling tighter and more impactful than ever. Even the sloggiest parts of this game are still pretty entertaining to play because you can blow up bugs really well, and sometimes cause corollary damage that'll require some rebuilding. The game offers a variety of guns and other destructive tools, but like Guerrilla, I didn't see much of a need for any other weapon except the nano rifle, which you get relatively early on here. The ease with which it vaporizes enemies and anything surrounding them provides some easy shots of brain chemicals. The railgun returns with its thermal scope, although it's a bit more restrictive than the original game with how much mass it'll image through. If I didn't love the nano rifle so much, I would have probably used this more. Armageddon's new magnet gun is one of those neat new physics toys that allows you to tether one thing to another and cause it to fling itself across the level. It's fine, but I think Just Cause 3 did it much better. The DLC delivers what's maybe the best non-nano rifle weapon in the game, the Shard Rifle, which allows you to gather loose objects into a mass and then fling them at high speed. That would have been much more fun than the magnet gun, but you only have access to it for about 15 minutes. The DLC also slides you the sharpshooter for loud, tinny one-shots that reminds me of Demons of the Badlands Spiker, but with a scope. Maybe my only gripe about the gunplay is, when playing with a controller, the left trigger lock-on mechanic doesn't always pick the closest, most threatening target. This is a flaw that emerges when you need it to not do that, like when you're being swarmed by baddies. Mech suits and augmented stompy vehicles return from Guerrilla as well, but not the largest, stompiest ones that would get stuck in the game's narrower levels. Several of the vehicles feature an alternate tactical vision that highlights enemies and destructible targets for easy kabooming. I don't know why you wouldn't just use this all the time. It would have been a fun feature while on foot too, because the goggles that the Red Faction wear don't seem useful for anything else. Love 'em or hate 'em, turret and blast a bunch vehicle sequences return, because this is a Red Faction game. While your enemies are initially human cultists, once you uncap the seal very early on to unleash the ancient evil plague, you're stuck with bugs and reptilian bugs and more bugs. Some gamers have compared your opponents, and subsequently the action of most of this game, to Starship Troopers, and that's definitely not wrong. Of course, like any game featuring bugs, there'll be spawn nests that you'll want to blow up too. It should be no surprise that the climax of the game takes place in a big, organic alien bug nest that houses the evil Bug Queen. This stuff writes itself, really. In fine Volition fashion, Armageddon actually features some fun bosses, because they're just prolonged combat encounters rather than half-hour combat arenas whittling someone down to nothing. A notable exception to this goodwill is your final confrontation with cult terrorist Adam Hale, while he's in a hobbling crab bot. This battle sucks because the only damage you can inflict is confined to extremely specific fixtures you knock down or blow up as you move backwards away from him. Fail to hit all the right marks at the right times and he will stomp the piss out of you. Once more, upgrades are facilitated with scrap as a currency, but instead of just knocking down buildings for it, it's also clustered in glowing Tron-like barrels hidden around the level, like old school collectibles. The weapon station from Guerrilla that once hung out in your safe house garages is now a standalone terminal. Likewise, upgrade terminals throughout the game seem like progress validators on how much salvage you should have. Considering all upgrades cost 1,000 scrap, except the final few, if you aren't carrying 1,000 scrap by the time you reach one, you'll have to wait until you reach the next station to spend your scrap, because you won't be doubling back through these sections. Your abilities come in 4 tier rings that unlock as you progress through the story, which is strange because you tend to encounter upgrade stations right before they unlock the next tier, and I don't understand that. In ditching the open world, this story-oriented linear adventure is a 1-2 punch featuring 24 10 to 20 minute levels. These are gameplay sprints that individually don't overstay their welcome, or at least try not to. The gaps between them are greased with cutscenes that move the story forward, keep you engaged with what's going on, and give you the visceral impression of progress. Several levels feature branching bronchial layouts that are a bit of a pain to navigate in these mostly cold, dark settings. Objective markers may be near you, but sometimes they're through a thick wall that requires some complicated navigation to get around to. Thankfully, there's a helpful breadcrumb path to guide you when you're truly lost. This is a game that is all about engagement, reveling in its visual storytelling, and a mission to keep telling you a story, as though the gameplay segments are the vegetables you have to chew through to get to the dessert. This helps because the loop of blasting bugs, accidentally destroying stuff, and then needing to restore it with the nanoforge can get repetitive. But, despite its best efforts, this is a game with a strange amount of filler. It's not a long game, about the same length as the original, minus the time I wasted redoing chunks of it because of the soft locks. Still, this game feels padded to justify its elaborate, expensive production. The multiple sections where you blast a number of blanks to shoot down blank to do blank could have been nixed. That entire chunk of the game where you're wandering through underground caverns to decode a monk's encrypted last message could have been snipped. That part where you're on the lava barge hopping on and off to eventually destroy a big glowing stalactite thing, cut that all out. There's so much busy work in here, and holistically, it's fine, but not quite fun enough to justify its existence. Yes, this is sometimes a visceral cinematic experience. Yes, there are big set pieces. Yes, the production values are probably the best I've ever seen in a Volition game to this point. And yet, there's very little actual story here. The characters don't develop at all. They have no arcs to speak of. The connection to Capek's work at Ultor is underdeveloped, as it is in every other game. Why is Adam Hale really a villain? Why do we care about him? Who are the cultists he housed himself with, and what do they really believe? It's just not great. There's nothing thematically interesting about it. It's very tropey. While Guerrilla apparently featured some very hidden, mostly jokey audio logs, this game features actual functional audio logs from unnamed participants who try to fill in this world with backstory. But these really don't work for me. I should know because I've been an expert on audio logs since I talked about it at length in my System Shock series review, so go check it out. This is also, I'm sad to report, a very dumb story. So even with all this action and narrative, there's very little to attach to emotionally. Darius isn't just a meat-headed idiot. Beyond a few gasps, he expresses no emotional anguish, remorse, or regret, despite the horribleness of the events happening around him, many of which he is personally responsible for. He's kind of a smarmy dude who doesn't do anything except get more and more hopped up as the action escalates. His ex, and kinda still flame Kara, is killed toward the end of the game, and there's no emotional moment to it. Darius is so unaffected that it opens the possibility that she'll be found alive later on. Nope, she's done. He doesn't even care about humans much. I'm usually against resurrecting dead people for plushy feel-good conclusions, but this was such an awkward moment that was supposed to be dramatically important that I would have given it a pass. This is a game that's dark with bugs and other stuff that goes bump in the night, but I never felt the anxiety of a horror game. There never felt like there was menace or anything to fear. Maybe it was the easy access to plenty of bug-erasing weaponry, but even the graphic demise of Hale didn't do much to move the needle for me. And while the game does feel padded out, it also paradoxically feels like it's biting off more than it can chew, as though this game has 2 Death Stars to blow up over the course of an 8-hour game. Gears of War's first campaign against the Locusts took place over the course of 3 games, plus the upcoming E-Day prequel. Armageddon is trying to do it all in one go. Why show off that one of the locales is the destroyed town of Dust from Guerrilla if the game's not going to do anything with it? How do the Red Faction fit into this world? They seem to be just an independent army or something. These are just the simple things that they could have flushed out to make this whole thing feel more better. None of this is to say that the game would have sold better if the story weren't so underwhelming, because this franchise was retired immediately after this game's failure. But for other broader thematic reasons we'll get to later, a better story would have been better for the time you're playing this game anyway. At least you get a New Game Plus mode and multiplayer, but good luck finding anyone to play with these days. Armageddon's Path of War DLC is a trio of prequel vignettes leading up to the campaign on the Terraformer, and one more after the events of the game. Well, I think it is. Like Guerrilla's Demons of the Badlands, this comes from an era where our standards for downloadable story expansions were a bit lower. The cutscenes that the base game finds so essential have had their budgets reduced, so you get some small bits of animation that rely heavily on voiceover to carry the narrative. It tries to bridge some gaps in the story, but the whole thing really just feels like a rush job that doesn't make much sense. First up is a tribute to Volition's own Descent, where you fly around doing shooty stuff as an aerial fighter, minus that game's true 6 degrees of freedom as Hale's right-hand man, Malice. It starts off interestingly enough, but before long it devolves into a repetitive dungeon crawl through a zigzagging tunnel where you blow up Red Faction troops and structures. It didn't click for me that it was a tribute to Descent until you blow up Red Faction's core in a multi-stage process, and then you have to escape within an allotted amount of time, which kicks off a departure cutscene in your Descent-shaped fighter. I thought that was cute, Material Defender. The second episode, Tip of the Spear, is a tank sequence that evokes memories of Guerrilla. It's fun to blow up stuff, but with its simple map layout and limited number of enemies, that goodwill begins to run out pretty quick. Segment 3 has you on foot as Darius, using the orbital cannon to destroy cultist towers ahead of their advance on the Terraformer. The highlight here is the shard gun I mentioned earlier that lets you fling rubble at people and structures to knock them over. The final section, Malice, takes place 5 days after Darius unleashes the Plague, as you work to take out the big bad dude. It's about flipping switches to gain access to him in a final boss battle, and it's probably the least interesting segment of the DLC. He's also still wearing his Red Faction outfit and goggles, so I don't know. I can almost copy-paste my final thoughts on this DLC from my thoughts on Demons of the Badlands. The content here is skimpy, repetitive, and really just more for the sake of being more. It's not bad by any means, it's just I'm not mad at the people who worked on it for however many months to plan, build, and ship this thing, but it feels as joyless to play as it seems it was for them to make. It's a difficult recommendation unless you just absolutely loved playing this game, because it's such an inferior combination of scenario, level design, and narrative compared to the base game, which already had its own issues. Coming off another playthrough of Guerrilla, I really appreciated Armageddon's more focused, shooter-friendly gameplay in a shorter game, at least initially. Unfortunately, in time, it feels like it just keeps going, and as a result, it often feels slower and longer than Guerrilla. It overstays its welcome because it simply doesn't have very compelling characters despite the larger cast. It doesn't have interesting emotional stakes, a cohesive narrative, or a very interesting plot. Those are things you can't skimp on when you switch from an open worlder to a tighter, cutscene-heavy, narrative-driven game. Darius is also a stupid asshole, and I didn't like him one bit. What really brought me to the finish line, besides an obligation for this review, was that after 3 games, Armageddon seemed to finally nail the combat feel, which may be its greatest achievement. Even if it's boring to watch, and sometimes even boring to play, shooting bugs while destroying and building stuff was a good loop. Unfortunately, Volition only really figured it out in this game at the end of the line. Armageddon sold poorly despite Danny Bilson's transmedia ambitions, which tracks considering as a whole, it sucked. During his tenure at THQ, the publisher slimmed its portfolio of development studios from 17 to 4, which wasn't entirely his fault, but it showed how out of touch he seemed to be. Armageddon joined several other high-profile THQ bombs during this time that ruined the publisher's finances. Saints Row III was successful, but it wasn't enough to cover the rest of the bleeding across the company. Bilson was fired early the following year. So the big question I wonder is, why did they make this game? Or rather, why did they make it this way? Reading old articles and reviews from the gaming press, it's apparent that the switch away from the open world format was okay for quite a few gamers because of how tedious Guerrilla could be. But this doesn't feel like quite the right answer, because no one bought this game. Heck, I didn't even buy it until this review well over a decade later. I think of games that came out just a few years later, like Guerrilla's Mediterranean cousin, Just Cause 3, of what this game could have been if they decided to stay the course from Guerrilla rather than take a swift 90-degree turn into this thing. I haven't been able to find anything from Volition about why they made this comprehensive pivot that ultimately burned the franchise and its future, with a Hollywood-tinged experience. Even the developer diaries for this game fail to address why they made such a hard pivot here too. Clearly, THQ was willing to invest tons of money into this, but maybe they couldn't afford another 5-year development cycle like Guerrilla's. I say maybe because a year after Armageddon's release, THQ declared bankruptcy. For years, Armageddon and the fate of this franchise is something that's perplexed me. Now, having worked through Red Faction's decade on this planet, it seems the answer is so much bigger than these two games.
Repta, resistance heavy, outnumbered 15-1. Under control.
So, what is this series? What is Red Faction? Each of these 5 games is unique. Playing one is a different experience than playing any of the others. In viewing this franchise as a whole, in seeing how they were nearly working from a blank slate with each title, I wondered why its accomplishments and successes weren't really allowed to aggregate. It's as though Volition didn't understand why each of their games succeeded individually or even in small part. You look at the bones of this series, of the things that unite everything it does, and it's clear that Red Faction is a coat rack, a very loose framework upon which Volition could hang a variety of science fiction tropes. The connecting rod is geomod and dynamic destruction. These games are at their best when they're letting you blow stuff up and solve environmental puzzles with destruction. This is tied to Volition's technical proficiency, based in a university town like Champaign, Illinois, that allowed it to accomplish very interesting things with its game engines. And then, in-game, it's perpetuated with a blank slate protagonist and demolitions expert who can blow stuff up, damage the environment, and tear down structures to fulfill the franchise's prophecy. Yes, the series also has Ultor's Capek, the weird space gremlin who allows for a vague semblance of lore, and all kinds of weird mutant and alien enemies with little explanation. But these games take storytelling and lore so unseriously that it would be easier to forget he exists than to keep his legacy intact. People really love 2 games in this series, the original game and Guerrilla. Why? Because they leaned on geomod and its destructive possibilities. Like Minecraft, you play these games, or someone pitches you on these games, and your mind automatically fills with possibility. They're not just games, they're play spaces, conquerors of the imagination. You see how much Volition loved laying the groundwork in these games, even if they don't ultimately deliver on that potential. The pivots from Red Faction to Red Faction 2 and Guerrilla to Armageddon were disappointing because they decided, for whatever reasons, to build something on top of that destructive potential that didn't celebrate it nearly as well by trying to cram in B-tier narratives that suck up most of those games' oxygen. It's like being invited to the coolest playground as a kid, but you're told you can't play with any of the equipment. You have to sit in a corner and watch a movie on one of those rolling carts we had in school. And it's about not doing drugs and stuff. Armageddon in particular was disappointing because rather than expand and experiment with Guerrilla's greatest strengths, things that people genuinely enjoyed, somewhere between Volition and Danny Bilson, it became something totally different. Everything in Armageddon that wasn't directly related to blowing stuff up was a threat to your enjoyment. The lore and characters of Armageddon, and Red Faction as a whole, are its least interesting part. This series' linear, inconsistent, sometimes expensive, and usually underwhelming or outright bad stories aren't why people come to this series. So why emphasize that? Why headline this act with no one came to the show for? With geomod as a base and then never building a strong cast of characters or central lore, Volition dressed Red Faction with whatever tropes were available. This series is about rebellion, terraforming, Mars, Earth, nanotechnology, underground bugs, ancient civilizations, freedom fighters, and oppressive regimes. It's first person, it's third person, it's open world, it's closed world, it's light, it's dark. Red Faction is just a place where Volition could hang its ambitions and try something strangely different with each new iteration. But successful franchises require consistency. Saints Row, the open-world urban crime series that seemed to keep the studio and THQ itself alive despite their missteps, served as the studio's flagship franchise because it was reliable and predictable between games. Granted, that fourth one does some really weird stuff. And then that reboot. Still, there's a central lore and strong cast of characters there. You buy a Saints Row game and you know what to expect, but you buy a Red Faction game and you never really know. Each Red Faction game could have piloted its own independent franchise. That's how disconnected they are. You'd think after Red Faction 2's departure from the original game, which is, by all accounts, the only truly critically and commercially successful game in the series, Volition would stop flinging demolition charges at the wall to see what blows up. But that's the thing. Each subsequent game failed to move the needle, failed to appeal to broader audiences. Even Guerrilla, a full-throated reboot that was trying to cash in on the growing trend of open-world games at that time, supposedly still lost money for THQ, according to former senior producer Jim Boone. It can be very easy to see how Volition thought, why not pivot to something drastically different for Armageddon? Why not chase trends? What did they really have to lose? The problem is that this experimental approach where each game is dramatically different than the last only really works when you have a solid IP to start with. It's okay for Star Wars to have a shooter game and an RPG and a strategy game because it's based on a very firm and successful series of movies. Red Faction isn't. The franchise flailed as it moved between installments, success far from guaranteed, and possibly hindered because of its unpredictability. Like, of course I'm not going to care about a Syfy Red Faction show about Alec Mason and his kids if the game series has little reverence for them either. On top of that, THQ was a flailing, financially fragile company for a very long time. They made so much money with games based on licensed titles that as they came out of fashion through the end of the aughts, they had to turn inward towards original titles. Volition was very important for that. Not only did THQ bet large on Red Faction toward the end of their existence, they also banked large on the U-Draw game and drawing tablet being successful on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 when it had done well on the Wii. As it turns out, Nintendo's console was the only platform where it seemed to find an audience, requiring THQ to declare a $100 million loss, money they definitely didn't have. The failures of Armageddon and U-Draw were a 1-2 punch that accelerated THQ's decline. But even then, Red Faction never seemed to receive the financial or logistical attention it needed to be truly successful. None of Volition's games seemed to. Thinking about it now, this may have also fueled their devil-may-care attitude game to game. Remove Geomod from the first two games and you have two very standard and very forgettable first-person console shooters compared to their contemporaries. Guerrilla feels like a game that's missing parts and polish that had to be cut to make its ship date. The turnaround on Armageddon was brief. You go and play the best examples of the genres that Volition dabbled in, and their games often felt like store-brand also-rans, destined to land in the zeitgeist as little more than blockbuster weekend rentals. Through a series of corporate transactions following THQ's bankruptcy, Volition and Red Faction wound up, or would eventually wind up in the hands of the Embracer Games conglomerate. Once known as Nordic and then THQ Nordic, Embracer recklessly purchased studio after studio with no plan to maintain or develop these IPs. Fish Labs, another studio owned by Embracer, had reportedly been working on a Red Faction prototype as late as 2023, patterned off of Guerrilla's open-world gameplay. With the closure of Volition, they decided to cancel their Red Faction ambitions before facing their own layoffs. Today, Red Faction as an IP is still lost in the massive pile of goo that is the Embracer Group, which will be split into a trio of new companies in the next few years. It's a mess. Everything over there is a mess, and it's clear that the series will remain in stasis for a long time to come. But let's be realistic here. Is it actually worth much beyond some nostalgia? Could a game come along and do right by what Red Faction tried to do and actually be more successful without the franchise's baggage of decent but never great output? As it stands, these games represent very specific moments in time. People have fond memories of whatever Red Faction game they latched onto, and if the games had been more structurally sound or better produced, they wouldn't have aged out to become bargain bin fodder as quickly as they did. This is not a series that will be hailed in the great halls of video games. The interconnectivity between them is more theoretical and conceptual than literal, which makes Red Faction as a whole less than the sum of its parts. The tragedy of Red Faction is that for all of its flaws, for all of Volition's efforts, they never quite found a formula that worked like they did with Saints Row. Saints Row, in turn, is a series that only seemed to run out of fuel because THQ lost so much money making games that weren't Saints Row that they had to keep making Saints Row to survive, which strangled the series. Once just an expansion for Saints Row III, Saints Row 4 was built out into an entirely new game that utilized the exact same city and was developed in a very brief time frame, similar to Red Faction 2, or even Armageddon. I don't pine for more Red Faction. Despite so many games, so much attention, and so many countless man-hours in development, few people are clamoring for Volition's old Martian-themed Destructathon. But as someone who regularly complains to stop resurrecting old franchises and ideas, there's plenty of vital material to steal from Red Faction to make something new and interesting, without the name or characters which were never really worth that much to begin with. And this isn't a slag on Volition as a developer and their hard work, but working through the installments of the series, it clicked. I've seen where the series has gone and what it's accomplished. If Red Faction had focused on being open-ended experiments with environmental destruction rather than the elaborate, expensive detours into what neither the developer nor the franchise were good at, we'd still be talking about the series today. We might be playing a Red Faction game today, right now. Use Guerrilla as a starting point, make its open world more compelling and vibrant, make its gameplay more interesting, make the feel snappier and its gameplay loop less repetitive, and I think that's the way forward. Until a publisher or developer can understand what made Red Faction special, it will remain exactly where it dug itself into, deep in the minds of our nostalgia, toiling away, dreaming of liberation. Well, hello there, you've reached the end of the video, and if you're watching this or listening to this, be sure to hit the like button. You've already made it this far. You've already, committed to the bit. Hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe. Check out my other 33 reviews. I've got them all out there. They're across all space and time. Hello. Next video is the 10th anniversary edition of the channel. Yes. I do have to thank my Patreon producers here. James Wyatt, Lee Kenyon, Christina Adams, Mitchell, Rain101, Romega, Steven Brunwasser, and Yahoo Silver Man. That is the silveriest man that I know. I'm sure I've made that joke before. I did not watch the end of my previous review for Cyberpunk again to see what I said at the end, but I did a little bit for Starfield. So anyway, stay tuned, like and subscribe. Hit up the Patreon, please. Go check it out. Be a producer like these people and get early access to stuff, like in-development builds of this review and stuff like that. Get a feel. Anyway, have a good time. I love you.